Today, I'm going to share the story behind one of the creepiest videos on the internet. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's house, and as soon as the like button sits down to watch their favorite TV show, start violently vacuuming right in front of the TV. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In the summer of 2013, a middle-aged man named Frank pulled into a tiny town in Nevada called Kingston. Kingston, which is home to less than 100 people year-round, is so small and desolate and cut off from the rest of the state and really the rest of the country that they don't even have stoplights. It's basically just a collection of a handful of buildings like a laundromat and a saloon that are surrounded on one side by this huge mountain range and on the other just open desert. At the time, there were really only 2 reasons you would find yourself in Kingston, Nevada. 1, if you lived there or were visiting someone that lived there, or 2, if you were going to visit the abandoned mines up in the mountain that are right near Kingston. Frank was in Kingston for the latter. For the last 5 years, Frank had been traveling all over Nevada and California and just the West Coast in general, exploring abandoned mines. And he would film himself while he was in there, and then when he got back to his house, he would upload the footage to his YouTube channel. When he arrived in Kingston, Frank had already uploaded 302 videos to his channel. But despite the very high number of videos on his channel was still very, very small, and it wasn't growing really at all. So for him to be dedicating that much time and energy into making these videos indicated that he wasn't really doing it for YouTube fame. He was doing it because he had a passion for exploring these mines, and he wanted to share it with the few people that subscribed to his channel. And when you look through the first 302 videos on his channel, that passion of his really comes through. He always knows the history of the mine he's about to go into, and when he goes inside, if he finds machinery or pieces of equipment that have been left behind, he immediately knows what they are, and he speaks about them with relative sophistication. He has this lingo that sounds like he understands mines on a really granular level. So when Frank arrived in Kingston in 2013, as far as we know, the only reason he was there was just to do what he always did, which is go explore a couple of cool mines, film it, and then put it on his channel. Except this time, Frank's adventure into these mines right outside of Kingston would be cut short by something he just could not explain. However, he captured it on film, and it's terrifying. The 2 mines that Frank was intending to visit were the Victorine mine and the Horton mine. The Horton mine was constructed first in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and when they built it, they expected it to be a gold mine, but there was no gold inside. So they constructed another mine about 900 feet above where the entrance to the Horton mine was. They built this other mine, and inside of that mine, there was gold. This second mine they built was called the Victorine mine. When they built the Victorine mine, they bored this massive hole right outside the entrance to the Victorine mine that went straight down 900 feet directly into the mountain, and this big hole they drilled went right into the Horton mine. This was on purpose. They were basically building the equivalent of a laundry chute, except instead of tossing laundry down it, they would toss the ore they drilled from inside the Victorine mine. They would drop it down the chute. It would fall 900 feet all the way to the Horton mine, and that would save them from needing to carry all of this ore all the way down the mountain. Basically, it was a shortcut for the ore. And in the Horton mine, they built this huge conveyor belt system so that anything that came off of the chute would land at the beginning of this conveyor belt, and it would get brought all the way outside of the mine where workers could process it and bring it to town. Finally, in 1989, the Victorine mine ran out of gold, so they permanently shut down that mine as well as the Horton mine. These 2 mines were located about 4 miles to the west of Kingston's town center. And so when Frank pulled into town, he moved to the western side of town and then found the access road that would bring him out to these mines. And so he just drove on this road that basically shot straight towards this huge mountain range. And after traveling about 4 miles, he reached this very sharp right turn turn that basically went straight up a mountain. And at this point, there's no more pavement on the road. It's a very narrow trail. It's hard to see. And so Frank would have parked his car, grabbed his camera and his equipment, and begun walking up this mountain. After quite a while, Frank would have passed a couple of rundown old cabins that were kind of overgrown. These cabins were used when these mines were in operation. They helped service the workers while they were out there. But since the mines were abandoned, so too were the cabins. And so when Frank got to these cabins, that would have meant he was very close to the entrance to both of these mines. Frank first went to the Victorine mine, which would have been very easy to spot because right outside of its small entrance was this huge piece of what looked like scaffolding, and that was actually the opening to this huge chute that shot down 900 feet to the Horton mine below. So Frank goes to the Victorine mine and he has a look around, but either Frank didn't film his time inside of the Victorine mine or he just didn't upload it because there's no video of him actually going into the Victorine mine. His camera is turned on this particular day when he's left the Victorine mine and he's walked all the way down to the entrance of the Horton mine. And so we see this video. It opens up with the camera pointing at the entrance to the Horton mine. And the entrance to the Horton mine is very bizarre looking. The entrance, which is 20 feet tall, has all these long strips of metal plating that have been kind of anchored up all around the entrance to prevent the entrance from caving in on itself. But despite whatever functional value these copper plates might have had, the aesthetic result is very creepy and makes you not want to go in the entrance. Also, because this mine had been shut down, there's a big gate right in front of this already very foreboding entrance that warns people to not go inside. But Frank seems totally unaffected by this and just strolls right up to the entrance of Horton Mine, and he kind of talks about its history, and then he calmly steps over this warning gate telling people to stay back, and he begins walking into this mine. Right away, Frank notices there's quite a bit of water on the ground, and that's cause for concern.
Okay, we can go in here and just take a quick look. I don't think I'm going to explore this particular mine. There's a little bit too much water in here, and I know this mine is really old, but I just don't think it's wise to go in here when there's water. Try to avoid this if I can.
Frank's not concerned that there is water. It's that the water might be stagnant water. In these abandoned mines, there can be poisonous gases that accumulate, and when there is stagnant water, those gases get absorbed into the stagnant water. And so if Frank were to step into one of those puddles of water, he would release those gases from the water, the so-called bad air, and that can actually be deadly. But as Frank is standing there wondering if he should proceed, he looks down off to the left side, right inside the entranceway, and he notices there's some footprints. So somebody must have come in here recently, and so Frank decides, you know what, I'll go a little bit further in, I'll just be really careful of the water. Frank makes it about 10 feet inside of the entranceway when he lifts his camera up and he looks straight down into the mine, and you get your first look at really what the inside of this mine looks like. And right away, you notice there's this yellow kind of collapsed looking tubing that's hanging down from the ceiling, and that's the old air filtration system. And then when Frank moves maybe another 5 or 10 feet farther into the mine, you see in addition to this air filtration system, there's also all these metal chains that are just kind of dangling from the ceiling, and they're all over the place. And both the tubing and the chains seem to extend all the way into the tunnel out of view. Those chains were previously used to hold up the conveyor belt that stretched the entire distance of this mine, which is 600 feet long. They held that conveyor belt up, which carried all of the ore from the chute out of the mine. Even though Frank has seen similar setups in other mines he's been into, he would say on camera that there's just something really off about this mine, that it was really sketching him out, and he wasn't really sure if he should keep going.
Yeah, this looks pretty sketchy. I'll go a few feet further in and check it out, but I think I'm going to pass on this one.
He would later reflect on that feeling he had inside of the mine, and he would say, you know, it felt like there was somebody else in that mine watching him. It was just very, very uncomfortable. And so as Frank is debating whether or not he should continue, just based on this kind of bad vibe he was getting, he looks down and notices there's actually running water now. Before at the entrance, it was stagnant, but now he can see the water inside of this mine. It's not stagnant, it's running, and so the risk of breathing in any bad air is pretty much gone, meaning this mine is relatively safe. But despite this supposedly positive development for someone who wanted to explore a mine, Frank is still not sure if he should continue.
This is one of the creepiest mine tunnels I've ever been in, just because of how dilapidated it is and all these chains hanging down from the overhead, and there's a shot looking down the tunnel even further.
But despite his apprehension, Frank ultimately decides, you know what, he'd come this far, I'll just go a little bit farther. And so Frank makes it to about 100 feet into this mine when he turns around and he films the opening, the entrance to the mine, which is all lit up with sunlight. And he films it kind of to give the audience a sense of just how far he had come into the mine. And so then, after filming the entrance, he turns the camera and he films back down towards the back of the mine, towards the actual end of the mine. Now, at first, you don't see anything unusual. You just see the chains, and it looks kind of like it had for the first couple of minutes of this video. But then, Frank pulls his flashlight out and he shines it down the hall.
Looking down the tunnel here, I don't know why that one chain is swinging back there.
As we saw, Frank's initial reaction to this swinging chain is speechlessness. And then just sort of this weird statement of fact that he's like, I don't know how that chain is swinging. And then after staring at this chain and even zooming in on it, trying to kind of figure out what he's looking at, Frank eventually would just turn off his camera, turn around, and leave very quickly. And when he got back to his house, he uploaded this video to his channel with virtually no context. He just said, this is what I saw inside of the Horton mine, and nothing happened. It didn't go viral. It isn't like everybody went crazy when they saw this footage. Instead, I think his audience, they saw this video and didn't really know what to make of it. And then very quickly, his audience and Frank just kind of forgot about it. And Frank got back into making his kind of traditional videos. Then, about a year later, the YouTube algorithm kind of noticed this Horton mine footage that he had uploaded back in 2013, and it went crazy viral. And immediately, this video was put under the microscope by YouTube personalities, by TV personalities. I mean, everybody was just kind of taken aback by this footage. And what was determined fairly early on was the actual video itself was authentic. Frank really did film a swinging chain in the Horton mine in Nevada. The question became, who swung the chain? There are many people that believe Frank swung the chain, and this is all just one big hoax, and they point to some of his newer videos after this video went viral, where it appears that Frank is kind of actively going out to find paranormal activity versus just going out and exploring mines. And so they point to that and say, look, he's looking for this stuff. This can't be authentic. This video has to be fake. But others say, look, Frank is just a guy who likes going into mines, and he films the inside of these mines. He's been doing it for years and years, and he just happened to be in one when something unexplainable happened, and he happened to catch it on film. And the only reason he began kind of actively looking for paranormal activity after it went viral is because kind of overnight, his channel exploded, and he suddenly had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of subscribers that all came from that swinging chain video, and they all wanted the same thing: more swinging chain videos, more paranormal content. And so, seeing a great opportunity, Frank went out and began looking for paranormal content. That's why most of his videos, after that video where the swinging chain happened, are kind of geared towards fishing for that kind of stuff. But that first video, that swinging chain video, there wasn't really a good incentive for Frank to fake it at the time he uploaded it. Obviously now you can say, oh, well, he staged it because he wanted it to go viral and he wanted to become famous and then have this great YouTube career. Look, it's all in front of us. It's so obvious. But how could Frank have possibly predicted that that video would go viral? Going viral is so hard, and it happens so rarely, and it's nearly impossible to predict. And so how could Frank, who had uploaded hundreds and hundreds of videos before, and none of them had come anywhere near virality, how could he have said, this one, this is going to go viral. It's just such a long shot. It also seems very uncharacteristic for Frank to have been diligently uploading on this YouTube channel, which was basically a passion project, for 5 years. He's uploaded 302 videos, and all of them are the same. He's posting the same type of content very consistently for the same small, loyal following, and then out of left field, he uploads his ghost video with no context. Even if he was trying to go viral with this video, he would have known that the most likely outcome would be that the video did not go viral, and instead his small, loyal following that was used to a particular type of content would see this video and be like, huh, why did he upload that? Or worse, they would think, is he faking this? Is this a hoax? And if so, that would totally tarnish his reputation and he'd lose probably some of his precious few subscribers. I mean, it just didn't feel like the juice was worth the squeeze. But regardless, even though lots and lots of people have said, you're lying, Frank, you're lying, Frank, you're lying, Frank, he said, I'm not lying. I was in the Horton mine. I filmed what I filmed. It's up to you what you believe. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go to the like button's house, and right as the like button is sitting down to watch their favorite TV show, start violently vacuuming right in front of the TV. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and mugs and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen, where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story is about a chance encounter between 2 men in Canada. Now, at first, these 2 men hit it off and became fast friends. But as time wore on, it became very clear that both men were keeping secrets from the other. And eventually, those secrets were exposed. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please reprogram the like button's TV remote so that every time they try to change the volume, it just turns off the TV. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One evening in late 2003, a 22-year-old man named Michael Bridges sat down in the stands of a professional hockey game in Calgary, which is a major city in Canada. And as he sat there staring out at the rink, waiting for the players to file in, he thought to himself how amazing it was that he was here right now. He couldn't believe how lucky he was to be here. So Michael lived about 700 miles away in a city called Brandon, which is also in Canada. And for the last year, Michael's life had gone really badly. He was struggling financially and in between jobs. He had gone through a recent terrible breakup. A lot of his friends had sort of vanished from his life. And so for the most part, he was sort of sad and lonely all the time. But then he'd won a sweepstakes that he had only entered on a whim and gotten an all-expenses-paid trip to Calgary for this hockey game. And so it felt like finally something good was happening in his life. Michael was about to flag down a vendor and order himself a beer when this guy he didn't know, this stocky guy with a mustache, walked in and sat down right next to Michael. And before Michael could say anything, this guy looked at him with a big smile on his face and he said, "Man, I'm so excited to be here. I won this ticket in a sweepstakes." And Michael was like, dude, me too. And so right away, these total strangers just totally hit it off. And before long, they were chatting about their lives. And, Michael, who over the last year, most of his friends had sort of disappeared in his life, it was great to have a guy that just seemed to get him. And so the time flew by. And Brock must have felt the same way about Michael, because as the hockey game ended, Brock asked Michael if he wanted to, keep the party going and go together to a strip club right down the road. And Michael was like, yeah, let's do it. And so the two new friends left the hockey game together, they went to the strip club, and as soon as they got there, Michael began to notice something odd about Brock, or at least something he hadn't noticed before. And that was that even though Brock appeared to be very blue collar, sort of like Michael was, Brock appeared to have a lot of money. I mean, he was leaving these huge tips for all the bartenders, and he was paying for he and Michael's drinks round after round. Brock was paying for all of it. And then also, Brock had this huge wad of ones and bills that he was basically throwing at all the dancers. And Michael, who was caught off guard by this, gladly accepted Brock's generosity. I mean, at this point, given Michael's financial struggles, he could not have afforded even a normal night out, let alone a lavish one like this. And so as the two men stood at the bar towards the end of the night, Michael thanked Brock for making this such a fun night, and he said he really didn't want to leave and go back to his hometown of Brandon, 700 miles away, because he was having so much fun here with Brock. But when he said Brandon, Brock stopped and he's like, wait a minute, Brandon? I'm moving to Brandon for work. And when Michael heard this, he was ecstatic. I mean, he was thinking this was going to be a one-off thing, that he would likely never see Brock again, despite how cool this guy was. But now it seemed entirely possible that if they were living in the same town, they could be actual friends. And so Brock told Michael that, hey, if you help me find an apartment in your hometown once I move there, maybe I can repay the favor by helping you get some work. And so Michael, he took one last look at that big wad of cash in Brock's hand, and he looked up at him and he said, deal. A couple of months later, in early December of 2003, Michael rode in the passenger seat of Brock's car as they made their way down a road in Brandon. The two had just had lunch together, and Brock was driving Michael home, when suddenly, Brock's phone rang. And when Brock answered it, Michael could tell right away, just from the tone of Brock's voice, that he was speaking to his boss. So ever since that hockey game, Michael and Brock had become friends. Brock had moved to Brandon, and Michael had helped him find an apartment, and in exchange, Brock had made good on his promise and had helped Michael find some work. In fact, he had gotten him a few odd jobs with the company that he, Brock, worked for. However, these jobs were not what Michael expected them to be, based on, his first impression of Brock. In reality, he felt like these jobs were kind of shady. Brock had asked Michael to start delivering these packages all over town, but he warned Michael to never look inside of any of these packages. Now, at first, obviously, Michael had been very unsure about taking Brock up on these jobs. I mean, it was pretty clear that whatever Brock was doing was, questionable or maybe even illegal, like what's going on with these packages. But, Michael thought back to that huge wad of cash that Brock had at the strip club in Calgary, and it just seemed like he was throwing money around, and Michael wanted money like that too. And so he thought, what's the harm? And so ultimately, Michael agreed to deliver one of these packages, and when nothing bad happened, he began delivering more. Now, Michael still had no idea what he was actually delivering. He had heeded the warning and was not looking inside these packages. Instead, he had sort of accepted the shadowy, mysterious stuff that Brock was doing was just sort of part of being friends with Brock and working for Brock. And so he had just gone along with it. And also, Michael genuinely needed the money. He really couldn't afford to just stop working. So as the two men continued down this road in Brandon, Michael just continued to sit quietly in the passenger seat while he listened to Brock speak to his boss. And at some point in this conversation, Brock looked very resigned and just said, okay, I'll take care of it right now. Then Brock abruptly hung up, and without saying anything to Michael, he just pulled a U-turn and began speeding in the opposite direction. And then a couple of minutes later, Brock pulled into this parking lot of the seedy hotel, and then before Michael could ask, what are we doing here? Brock turned to him and said, you stay here. And then Brock got out of the car, and he marched over to the door of this motel and began to knock. And Michael, he's in the car watching this, having no idea what's going on, and he sees the motel room door that Brock knocked on. It suddenly opened, and there was this woman who was inside the motel. And from Michael's perspective, it seemed like she was very startled to see Brock. And then she began trying to shut the door on Brock. But Brock, he reached out and he began pushing on the door to keep it open, and the two of them began yelling at each other. And Michael, he can't hear what they're yelling about, but clearly, they're having some sort of heated argument here. And at this point, Michael began looking around, hopeful that nobody was witnessing this. I mean, they could get in some serious trouble here. And then Michael turned his attention back to Brock and this woman, and he watched as Brock raised his fist and punched this woman square in the face. And she instantly crumpled to the ground, and Michael, he has no idea what to do here. And so he just sat there as Brock climbed on top of this woman who's laying on the ground, and he began repeatedly punching her over and over again until Michael could see blood all over her face. And then Brock, who seemed totally unfazed, slammed the motel room door and calmly walked back to the car, hopped in the driver's seat, and drove off without saying anything to Michael. And Michael just sat quietly for this ride. He really had no idea what to even say. Now, he already knew that Brock must be involved in some sort of criminal enterprise, and in virtue of Michael delivering those packages for him, he was also involved in whatever this organization did. But up until this point, up until seeing this beating take place, Michael had sort of assumed that whatever Brock was involved in couldn't be that big of a deal. I mean, certainly they weren't hurting people. But now, Michael realized he had been terribly wrong. Finally, Brock pulled up in front of Michael's house, and for the first time he spoke. He turned to Michael and he said, "Don't tell anyone what you saw." And Michael just nodded his head and said, "Yeah, I won't." And then Michael got out of the car and he rushed inside his house. Thank you to Rocket Money for sponsoring today's video. I found out last month that I was still paying for a subscription to a streaming service that I signed up for while we were on tour last year. I had signed up for this because I wanted to binge shows while we were on the road. I just forgot to cancel it. But today's sponsor, Rocket Money, not only identified for me that I was spending money on something that I didn't want, but they also canceled it for me. Once you connect your bank account, Rocket Money identifies all your subscriptions in a single list. From there, you can identify the ones that you don't want anymore, and Rocket Money may be able to help you cancel in just a few taps. I also love using Rocket Money for 3 other things. I use them to lower my bills, also to create a custom budget, and to increase my savings, all in one place. Let the app's negotiators go to work for you to find the best possible rate and to save you time. With Rocket Money, you can create a customized budget in seconds. The app shows you where your money is going at all times, and it will also notify you when your balance is low to avoid overdrafts and late fees. Rocket Money will help you choose a savings goal, then you simply pick your preferred savings frequency, and then you watch your savings grow. You can edit, pause, or withdraw at any time. Take control of your finances today. Go to rocketmoney.com/MrBallen to get started for free. Again, that's rocketmoney.com/MrBallen. Okay, back to the story. About a week later, Michael was at his home when his phone rang, and when he looked at the caller ID, he saw it was Brock. And at first, Michael couldn't help but feel like he didn't want to pick up the call, but he knew he would have to. Despite what had happened the previous week at the motel, Michael had not said anything to anyone. However, being loyal to Brock did not make him feel any better about it. In reality, Michael felt like at this point, he was in too deep with Brock, and he had no idea how to get out again, even though at this point he kind of wanted to. But for now, Michael had made the conscious decision to simply act like everything is the same, everything is normal, so he didn't raise any red flags with Brock. And so he ultimately picked up the phone. Brock didn't say hello or ask Michael how he was doing. Instead, he just told Michael that he had another delivery for him if Michael was still committed to this job. Now, Michael knew the right answer here would be to turn this down and not continue to go down this rabbit hole and get deeper and deeper in with Brock. But at the same time, Michael was worried if he refused this job that he might be put in danger. Like, he saw what Brock was capable of. Is that going to happen to him if he turns this down? And then on top of that, Michael needed the money. And so after a tense silence, Michael told Brock that yes, I'm still committed and I will do this delivery. Brock said that was very good. And he also told Michael that he and the boss were very impressed with Michael's silence. And then Brock hung up. Now, Michael did appreciate the compliment, but at the same time, it really did not change his situation at all. I mean, he was still in way too deep here and didn't know what he was going to do. And so reluctantly, he grabbed his keys and headed out to his car to go pick up this next package. 2 months later, in early February of 2004, Michael and Brock sat inside of a diner in Brandon eating a meal together. Things at this point had basically gone back to normal, Michael was regularly delivering packages for Brock, and the two of them were meeting for meals like this fairly often, where Brock would always foot the bill. But today, as Michael sat there staring at Brock, he could tell something was different. Brock seemed really agitated, like something was on his mind. He kept tapping his hand and kind of fidgeting in his seat. And eventually, Michael asked Brock, like, hey, are you okay? And to Michael's surprise, Brock kind of lit up. And he was like, oh yeah, I'm okay. In fact, things are more than okay. I actually have an offer for you that could potentially change your life. Brock again told Michael that he and the boss were seriously impressed with Michael's work so far. Not just the fact that he kept silent about the motel incident, but also they knew Michael clearly had not looked inside of any of those packages. And so collectively, this proved that Michael was dependable and loyal. And so he told Michael that what he wanted to do was introduce Michael to the boss, because he thought maybe the boss would take a liking to Michael and move him up in the organization. Maybe give him a more managerial role like Brock's, where the role was more prestigious and had more responsibility, but critically came with higher pay. After hearing this, Michael felt both excited and nervous. He was excited because he wanted nothing more than to make the kind of money that Brock did. And after working with Brock now for several months, Michael had become kind of desensitized to violence and danger. He realized he could put his morals aside if it meant he would never have to be financially insecure ever again. But the thing that made Michael nervous was meeting the boss. I mean, he really didn't know much about who this guy was. All he knew is he was perfectly prepared to resort to violence if people wronged him. And so Michael knew how critical it was to stay on this guy's good side. But as all these conflicting thoughts were swirling around Michael's head, Brock said something else. He said before he would actually take Michael to meet the boss, Michael had to pass one more test. Michael would have to prove that he was capable of more than simply delivering packages and keeping secrets. Basically, he needed to prove that he could be as cutthroat and brutal as Brock was. After saying this, Brock just kind of leaned back and stared at Michael, studying his reaction. And at first, Michael really didn't even know what to say or do. He was like, okay, is Brock expecting me to come up with, some sort of way that I can demonstrate this? Do I need to come up with a test myself and do it? Or is Brock about to give me some assignment? Like, what's going on here? But then, before Brock could say anything else to clarify this whole situation, Michael had this epiphany. He suddenly realized that he already had the proof he needed to demonstrate to Brock and to the boss that he could basically handle anything they threw at him. Before meeting Brock, something truly awful and just totally messed up happened in Michael's life, and Michael had persevered his way through it. And so Michael was thinking to himself, if he just told the story of what happened to Brock and to the boss, they would be convinced that he was their guy. And so feeling very confident, Michael looked Brock right in the eye and he told him about his past. And as he told the story, Brock's eyes went wide. And by the end of the story, when Michael finally finished up, Brock just said, okay, yeah, you're ready to meet the boss. The meeting with the boss was scheduled for a few days later. And on that day, Michael showed up to this fancy hotel in a nearby city. And when he walked into the lobby, he saw Brock was sitting there waiting for him. When Brock saw Michael, he smiled and stood up, gestured for Michael to come over, and then the two of them walked upstairs to a particular hotel room. But when Brock unlocked the hotel room door and the two men went inside this lavish suite with this gorgeous living room and an amazing view, Michael looked around and realized it was empty. And he said to Brock, like, where's the boss? And Brock said, the boss doesn't wait for anyone. People wait for the boss. And so just sit down, he'll be here soon. And so Michael said okay, and he took a seat and tried to stay calm. But in reality, he was very nervous. I mean, all this cloak and dagger stuff was really putting him on edge. He also knew he had to impress the boss when he got here, because if he did, he would have like this new lease on life, this big promotion, he'd be getting paid so much money. But if he didn't, if he failed to impress the boss, not only would he potentially be out of a job and back to sort of poverty, but also he could be in real danger here. And so as Michael is sitting there showing all the signs that he's totally nervous, Brock, who was in the room just kind of standing there, looked over and could sense, his friend clearly is on edge. And so he said, hey, Michael, here we go. Why don't you just run me through your story one more time, like a dry run, before you meet the boss. Get yourself ready. And so Michael, who at this point was so anxious, he was happy to be doing anything other than just sitting there quietly, quickly agreed to the idea and went through his story one more time. And right as he finished his story, there was a knock on the door. And so Brock said, okay, he's here. Are you ready? And Michael's like, yeah, I'm ready. And so Brock walked over to the door, took one more look at Michael, opened it up, and when Michael looked outside and saw who was out there, he knew immediately he had made a terrible mistake. It would turn out the last several months of Michael's life was one big lie. That sweepstakes that Michael had won that got him the tickets to the game in Calgary, that wasn't real. Somebody had set that up just so Michael could meet Brock. Those packages that Michael was delivering for Brock, they were not sensitive. It was just packages that contained flour, like cooking flour. And that woman that Michael watched Brock beat up at the motel, she was acting, and so was Brock. Nobody got hurt in that entire altercation, and the blood that Michael saw on her face, well, she had blood capsules hidden in her mouth that she popped to make it look like she actually got beat up. However, there was one thing that was absolutely true about the last few months of Michael's life, and that was that Brock really was involved in a secretive organization, and Brock really did want to bring Michael inside of it. It's just that the organization was not the criminal enterprise that Michael thought it was. Instead, it was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And Brock was an undercover officer running an elaborate sting designed entirely to get Michael to confess to his crimes, which he did while secret cameras inside of that hotel room recorded every single word he said. Michael's crime was murder. 2 years earlier, his girlfriend, Erin Chorney, had tried to break up with him, and he'd been so mad about it that he attacked her, wound up strangling her until she fell unconscious, and then he drowned her in the bathtub. And so this was the story he told Brock and intended to tell the boss to convince them that he was their guy, that he was tough and could do anything they wanted. He basically was telling them, hey guys, I'm literally a murderer. And so when they heard that knock on the door in the hotel room and Michael turned, expecting it to be the boss, well, instead, he saw a whole bunch of police officers coming into the hotel room to arrest him for that murder that he confessed to. Erin's body was ultimately recovered from the dump site where Michael had left her, and she was given a proper burial. As for Michael, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the morning of December 10th, 1995, a seasoned homicide detective walked into a house on a quiet street in the suburbs of Tucson, Arizona. Another officer led him down the hallway to a bedroom, and when the detective looked inside, he froze. Now, he'd seen a lot of crime scenes before, but this one had to be one of the worst. I mean, there was blood everywhere, all over the walls, all over the floors, the mattress. I mean, it was just a complete nightmare. But as much as it appeared like clearly he's looking at the scene of a murder, there was a problem. There was no body. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please hide mousetraps in all of the like button shoes. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of December 8th, 1995, a 41-year-old mother named Bonnie Sanborn set a box of cereal down on the dining room table inside of her home in Tucson, Arizona. She then called for her 3 kids to come eat breakfast, and just a few seconds later, her youngest son, 10-year-old Brandon, came bombing into the room and sat down at the table. Bonnie then poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it down the hallway to her 13-year-old daughter Candace's room. Candace was busy putting on makeup, and when Bonnie reminded her that it was almost time to leave for school, she just rolled her eyes and said, she'd be out in a minute. Then Bonnie continued going down the hallway and knocked on the door of her 15-year-old son Bradley's room. And when he didn't open the door, she shouted through the door that if he didn't get out of bed soon, she would come in there and literally drag him out. But there was still no response after she did this, so Bonnie put her ear to the door and listened for movement. She was hoping to hear sheets rustling or dresser drawers opening, but she didn't hear those sounds. Instead, she heard a different sound. It was like this weird clanking sound, like metal pounding against metal. And so because this noise was so unusual, she just opened up the door, and she found her son, Bradley, along with his friend, 18-year-old Jason Horbachevsky, squatting in the middle of the room, trying to pry open this big metal box with a crowbar and a hammer. Bonnie stepped fully inside the room to get a better look, and she saw there was a phone receiver dangling off the side of this metal box. It was clearly a payphone that Bradley and Jason had clearly stolen from somewhere out on the street, and now they were trying to, steal the quarters out from inside of it. Bonnie was so shocked that all she could think to do was just say, "What are you doing?" And Bradley, he looked at his mom and just seemed totally unfazed that she was in there, and he just said, "What? We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone." And then before she could react to that, Jason, so her son's friend, he looked over his shoulder at her also very nonchalantly and just began laughing in a way that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. At this point, Bonnie just stepped back into the hallway and just tried to think through what she should even do here. I mean, this is so obvious that they're committing a crime in her house right now. Like, what in the world? But at the same time, she'd been having problems with her son Bradley for a long time now. This was definitely not the first time she had caught her son, doing something bad. Her son had been known to throw parties in their house that he definitely was not supposed to. He would pick fights with basically everybody in the house, all the family members. And on top of that, she also knew that periodically he would hang out with known gang members. Now, for a while, Bonnie had tried to be understanding and supportive because she remembered how hard it was to be a teenager herself. But her son's trouble really just kept escalating. And this payphone thing was like a breaking point. She knew she could not let something like this slide. I mean, it was literally criminal, and so obviously so. And if she didn't step in now, it was clear her son would just continue to push the limits further and further until he got hurt or got somebody else hurt or, wound up in jail or something. Like, this was the moment she had to put her foot down. And so, without saying another word to her son or Jason, who were now back to banging on this metal box, she just turned and walked back into the kitchen where her other kids, Brandon and Candace, were now eating their breakfast and looking annoyed by all the chaos being caused by their older brother. And she walked right past them, picked up the phone, and she called 911. And when the dispatcher picked up her call, Bonnie said she wanted to report a theft, and she gave the dispatcher her own address. And then after she hung up, she told Candace and Brandon to go get their backpacks and go outside so they didn't miss the bus. A few minutes later, Bonnie heard a knock on the front door, and she opened it up to find two sheriff's deputies standing on the doorstep. She actually recognized the deputies, and she knew they also recognized her, because this was not the first time they'd been called to the Sanborn house. They'd been there several times actually recently to deal with domestic issues largely caused by her son. But Bonnie knew, Bradley, even though he was the obvious main problem, at least in terms of her current issues, she was already seeing that her 13-year-old child, Candace, had begun acting out a lot lately. And she was also worried what would happen when her 10-year-old, Brandon, became a teenager himself. Like, would he begin, following the footsteps of his brother and maybe his older sister as well? She didn't know, but she just couldn't understand why her kids just were misbehaving so much. Like, what did she do wrong? And so Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room, where he and Jason were still actively trying to pry open this payphone. And when Bradley looked up and saw the police, he looked furious. He screamed at his mother that he couldn't believe she'd called the cops on him. But Bonnie, she did her best to push down the natural bit of guilt she was feeling, because she didn't want to have to call the cops on her son. The deputies ultimately handcuffed both Bradley and Jason, and they walked them outside, and Bonnie trailed right behind them. And then as the police were putting the kids in the back of the squad car, Bonnie pulled one of the deputies aside and asked if he could make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. She knew this was a very tough love sort of approach. I mean, basically demanding your kid stays effectively in jail overnight. But she was also hoping that in addition to being maybe scared straight here, he would also get counseling in the juvenile detention center and maybe begin to see the value of staying out of trouble. The deputy nodded and said he'd see what he could do. As the squad car drove away, Bonnie saw movement in a window of the house across the street. She squinted and saw that one of her neighbors was peering out the curtains to get a look at all the commotion. And then further down the street, a couple out for a morning jog had slowed down and was just staring at the squad car as they passed by. And now for Bonnie, she wasn't that surprised. She'd be looking out the window too if police showed up on her street. But at the same time, it still made her very embarrassed. She knew people in this neighborhood were already very aware of her family's problems, and it was a lot to bear. And frankly, making it even worse was the fact that, generally speaking, Bonnie's neighbors were nice to her in person when they were face to face with her. People even went out of their way to help her, but she knew behind her back, people in this neighborhood gossiped constantly about her family. Now, for Bonnie, this was obviously humiliating and also very frustrating because how could she possibly stop gossip? She couldn't. But more than just disliking the fact that there were all these people talking about her, she also just felt very isolated right now. She was married, but her husband Robert had gotten a job in Maryland, and he only came home every other weekend. Bonnie had actually tried to sell the house in Tucson and move the whole family to Maryland, but she'd eventually decided it just wasn't really worth the trouble. Plus, Robert had already talked to his supervisor about potentially transferring back to Tucson, and he was supposed to be coming back for good just next week. And so at this point, Bonnie was just trying to survive here. She still felt very isolated, but she knew, Robert, he'd be back soon, and she wouldn't be alone anymore, and she would get to deal with the kids, with the nosy neighbors, with the police, with her partner. It just felt like that would be a whole lot better. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 p.m. that night, Bonnie brushed her teeth and put on her PJs. The house was quiet for once, except for the TV humming in the living room. She'd gotten a call from the juvenile detention center that afternoon, and Bradley was being held there on theft charges, which Bonnie thought was for the best. But his friend Jason was 18 years old, so he was not held. Instead, he was just given a ticket and released the same day. And Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley was out again, he and Jason would reconnect right away and just fall right back into their same old antics. Before she went to bed, Bonnie went to the living room where her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were on the couch watching TV. And she told them it was time for bed, time to turn off the TV and go to your rooms, but they just ignored her and just continued to watch TV. It was a Friday night, and the two kids didn't have anywhere to be in the morning, and Bonnie had just done enough fighting for the day. So she just decided, you know what? Let them stay up. They can go to bed when they want to. And so she told the kids to, don't stay up too late and go to bed soon. Then she left, leaving them on the couch. She went to her own bedroom and she turned out her lights. A few hours later, Bonnie woke up and looked over at the clock and saw it was near 3 a.m. And she also could still hear the TV on out in the living room. And so Bonnie cracked open her door and yelled down the hallway to the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed. And then as Bonnie got back in her bed, she heard the sound of the TV turning off and she heard footsteps walking down the hallway, and then the house was quiet. And she drifted back to sleep. But sometime before dawn, when it was still dark out, she woke up again. And when she rolled over in her bed, she opened her eyes and she saw there was a large figure standing over her bed. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to a eerily silent house. Normally, his mother would have already been awake, making breakfast or getting started on chores. But when he went out in the hallway, he didn't hear her. He went into the kitchen and he checked to see if she was there, but she wasn't. And there were no dirty pans or plates in the sink and no coffee in the pot. It looked like his mom hadn't even woke up yet, which was weird for a Saturday morning. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace said she hadn't seen her. So Brandon and Candace both went down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, and when she didn't answer, Brandon pushed the door open and looked inside. And what he saw made him gasp in horror. The bedroom was covered in blood, but the bedroom was also empty. His mom wasn't in there. Let me tell you about my newfound favorite treat. The other day, I had some family and friends over, and I couldn't wait to introduce them to my mochi. We all shared the mango, the strawberry, and cookies and cream, and unsurprisingly, everybody loved it. We even made a quick run to the supermarket afterwards to get more. Because sometimes the most simple pleasures in life bring the most joy.
like the joyfully chill sensation of biting into refreshing, creamy, chewy My Mochi ice cream. My Mochi ice cream is like this sweet ice cream dumpling. Creamy, premium ice cream wrapped in very satisfying, sweet, chewy dough that is both refreshing and indulgent. It comes in delicious flavors like strawberry, cookies and cream, and mango. My Mochi is only around 70 calories per piece, and it's easy to share because each box comes with 6 individual mochis. If you haven't tried My Mochi, you really don't want to miss out on this joyfully chill experience. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store.
Later that same morning, Detective Brad Faust pulled up outside of a house in the suburbs of Tucson. He was there to investigate a mother's apparent kidnapping from her own home. Faust was actually feeling a bit frustrated to be called out to yet another case like this when he was already juggling so many others. 1995 had proven to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders just that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was swamped. But as far as anyone knew at this point, this was not a murder, it was a kidnapping. All Faust had been told was that Bonnie Sanborn was missing, and her kids had called 911 after seeing that and also seeing all the blood in her bedroom. So Faust was holding out hope here that this was actually nothing that serious, and that they would find Bonnie relatively quickly and she'd be okay. He got out of his car and he saw that officers had already taped off the house. There was a young boy and girl sitting out on the front curb, looking terrified and visibly distraught. And Faust also noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts, and so he figured that they must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had made the 911 call, and he made a mental note that he would need to talk to them later. Then he walked through the front yard and went into the house. And right away, a crime scene photographer greeted him and then led him down the hallway. As he walked, Faust caught a glimpse of a family photo on the wall, which showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 kids, all smiling and looking like the perfect all-American family. Before opening the door to Bonnie's bedroom, the photographer paused and warned the detective that there really was a lot of blood in here. Faust nodded, and then the photographer opened the door, and Faust immediately saw what he was talking about. There was blood spattered all over the walls, the floor, the windows, and the mattress. He felt his heart sink as he realized that with this much blood loss, they probably would not be finding their victim alive here. But he knew it was going to be very hard to figure out what had happened here or who was responsible until they found her, dead or alive. And so Faust stepped into the room closer to the bed, where a forensic technician was swabbing for fingerprints. The mattress was completely soaked in blood, and on one of the pillows, he could clearly see a bloody handprint. He figured it either belonged to Bonnie or her kidnapper, but they'd have to wait for test results to be sure. Faust stepped back, and he noticed that the sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were sort of balled up on the middle of the mattress. And to him, it seemed like, given how much blood is in here and the fact that obviously Bonnie is not here, that clearly some sort of long and violent struggle took place in this room. And it seemed to him like the struggle must have originated on the bed, and maybe even the bulk of the struggle was happening on the bed. It's soaked in blood and the sheets are all messed up. And he's thinking, very likely then Bonnie was in bed when the attack began. Faust also noticed there was a folding knife with a red handle on the mattress, and there was also a purse that had been poured out. There were multiple credit cards and a checkbook that were just sitting on the bed, and the fact that these items were not stolen made Faust think that robbery probably was not part of the motive for whatever happened to Bonnie. But then, something on the floor by the bed caught Faust's eye. After double-checking that the room had already been photographed, Faust put on a pair of gloves and then crouched down and he picked it up. And what it was a small brown button. He carried it over to the closet and dug through Bonnie's clothes that were in there, and the button didn't seem to match anything that she owned. And so based on where it was found in the room, Faust thought, this button must have come off of somebody's clothes in the middle of this attack. It obviously could belong to Bonnie. It could have come off of what she was wearing and maybe is still wearing. Or this button could have come off of the attacker's clothes. And so Faust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it up. Then he kept looking around. And in the midst of all the blood that had been sprayed all over the room, he noticed there was a clear trail of red droplets that snaked across the carpet. The trail led to a sliding glass door that led into the backyard. And when he tried to open it, he realized it was already unlocked. The forensics officer told him that nobody had touched that door all morning, so it must have been unlocked before anybody arrived. Faust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard, and he followed the trail of blood across the grass all the way to a door that led into the garage. He noticed there were no drag marks in the grass, so Bonnie's attacker must have been carrying her, which sort of naturally suggested that whoever did this likely was bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But also, judging from the photos he'd seen on the walls, Bonnie was very petite, so really that didn't narrow it down very much. A lot of people could potentially lift Bonnie and carry her. Faust reached the door that led into the garage, and he turned the knob, and it was unlocked. He opened it up, and when he looked inside, there wasn't a car in there. But the trail of blood clearly went into the garage at least a few feet before it disappeared, so it seemed like the suspect had literally carried Bonnie in here, loaded her into the car that likely was in here and now was not, and they drove it away, carrying Bonnie with them. And so Faust knew his best shot at finding Bonnie was to, 1, identify the car that would normally be in this garage, and then once you have the identity of the car, to go find it. Once Faust had done his initial sweep of the house, he went outside and he crouched down next to Bonnie's 2 younger kids, Candace and Brandon. And both kids were still very shaken up and totally confused. And so Faust very gently asked them about the last time they had seen their mother. And Candace said it was around maybe 11:45 the night before when their mom had gone to bed. But she also added that maybe around 3 a.m., she and her brother Brandon were still up watching TV in the living room, and their mom had shouted from her bedroom for them to turn off the TV and go to bed. She said that when their mom did that, they did get up, they turned off the TV, and they went to their own bedrooms and went to sleep. And both kids said they didn't hear or see anything until they woke up later that morning and found what they found in their mother's bedroom. And so this gave Faust something to work with, because it meant, if what the kids were saying was true, that Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m., because that's when she yelled to her kids at 3. Plus, if the suspect came in through that back sliding door that went right into Bonnie's room, and they were able to do so without waking up the kids, and then after the attack being able to find very likely Bonnie's car keys, because that's the assumption, they found her keys and then loaded Bonnie into the car and drove off, again without waking anybody in the house, it suggested that whoever did this, they likely were relatively familiar with the layout of the house and had probably been there before. So maybe this is somebody that they all knew. Faust pointed to the blood that was on Candace and Brandon's shirts, and he asked them where it came from. And Candace would admit that before she called 911, she and her brother had desperately gone looking for their mom in the room, in this horrible bloody bedroom, but they couldn't find her, and in their efforts to find her, they had gotten blood on themselves. Now, of course, Faust understood that these kids had been through this horribly traumatic thing, and they were just looking for their mom, but he also now knew that very likely their crime scene was contaminated now because the kids went in there and touched a bunch of stuff. But of course, he did not tell the kids that he was in any way annoyed with them or that they had done anything wrong. Instead, he just told the kids to go inside and change their clothes and then give the clothes that had blood on them to the forensics techs because they needed to collect them as evidence. And he also told the kids to not go anywhere near their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded and stood up and grabbed her little brother by the hand, and as they walked back towards the house, a sheriff's deputy came up to Faust and told the detective that he should also make sure to talk to Bonnie's oldest child. She had a 15-year-old son whose name was Bradley. That evening, Detective Faust paced down the hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, holding a file folder in his hand. When he opened the door to a small office, a teenage boy was already there waiting, and Faust recognized him from the mugshot in the folder he had as Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest child. Faust walked in, and as gently as he could, he told Bradley that his mother was missing. And based on the blood and the knife they'd found in her bedroom, she'd likely been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and she could even be dead. So Faust knew that Bradley could not have attacked his mother because he'd been here in the juvenile detention center the whole time the attack took place. But Faust had done some digging on Bradley's friends. He slapped the file folder he was carrying down onto the desk in front of Bradley and began flipping through it, showing Bradley the information he'd found about, in particular, his friend Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several informants, he was known for carrying a knife around. And sometimes, apparently, he would pull that knife out and stab himself in the side of the head. And so Faust wondered out loud if the knife they'd found in Bonnie's bedroom was Bradley's friend Jason's. And maybe the attack on her was retribution for his mother calling the cops on Jason and Bradley that morning. But when Faust looked at Bradley for his reaction, he saw there were all these tears rolling down his cheeks, and Bradley choked out that he really didn't know anything. And as much as he argued with his mom, he would never hurt her. To Faust, Bradley's reaction actually seemed really genuine, and so he immediately figured that if the gang Jason was a part of, was responsible for whatever happened to Bonnie, Bradley appeared out of the loop. And so to get a better read on this situation, Faust felt like, trying to ask Bradley questions was not going to go very far. Instead, he would just go to Jason and talk to him. Later that same night, Faust sat in the station with a cup of coffee, combing through records on Bradley and also on Jason and Jason's gang. After speaking to Bradley earlier, Faust had immediately tried to locate and interview Jason, which proved to be much more difficult than he'd anticipated. He knew Jason was not in police custody since he'd been released pretty much immediately after the payphone debacle. But Jason also was not at any addresses that he'd been associated with in the past, so it was hard to tell where he even was. So, a few hours ago, Faust had sent out officers to speak to as many members of Jason's gang as possible to see if they knew where he was, and also to see if they knew anything about Bonnie. Now, so far, they had not located Jason, and nobody had brought anything up about Bonnie, but just then, Faust's office door opened, and a deputy told him there was someone he really ought to speak to that was out in the lobby. And so Faust got up, he went in the lobby, and who was waiting for him but none other than Jason. When Faust walked out there, Jason stood up from his chair, acting cocky and confident, and told Faust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to prove he had nothing to hide. And Faust, he didn't even bother asking where Jason had been. Instead, he just led him into an interrogation room, and when he sat down across from his newest suspect, he noticed the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the button that was found on Bonnie's bedroom floor. And also, a few of the buttons on his shirt appeared to be missing. Now, Faust controlled his excitement and didn't show it, and decided pretty much right away that he was not going to ask about the button, at least not at first. He didn't want to overplay his hand. Instead, he started the interview by asking Jason some standard questions about his relationship with Bradley, and also by extension, his relationship with Bonnie, Bradley's mom, and also where Jason was at the time of the attack. And Jason would admit that he was mad about Bonnie calling the police on him and Bradley. But he didn't have some big plan to get revenge. He insisted that he didn't know where Bonnie was or what had happened to her, and he'd been at home asleep on the night she was attacked. And at the end of the interview, he agreed to give Faust a DNA sample, and he even turned over his shirt with the missing brown buttons for forensic analysis. And so after that, Faust released Jason and decided it was time to call it a day.
You know those moments right before you start something new, when you're staring at the idea, running through every worst-case scenario, and wondering if you're making a huge mistake? That feeling of doubt and uncertainty can be paralyzing. But looking back, making that leap, despite the fear I had, was one of the best decisions I ever made when I started this Mr. Ballin adventure. Because sometimes the scariest step forward is the one that changes everything. Starting something new isn't just hard. It really is terrifying, especially when you're starting a business. But that's why it helps to have such a great partner like Shopify by your side. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses all around the world, from household names like Death Wish Coffee and Magic Spoon to brands just getting started. It's time to turn those what-ifs into sales with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/MrBallin. Go to shopify.com/MrBallin. Again, that's shopify.com/MrBallin.
The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, so a day after Bonnie went missing, Faust sat in his office and sorted through all the information his team had collected the day before. While Faust had interviewed Bradley and Jason, other members of his team had spoken to Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, it looked like nobody knew anything that was helpful. A few neighbors had mentioned that the Sanborns had family problems, but apart from that, they all said Bonnie seemed nice, and they had no idea who would want to hurt her. Faust continued reading, looking for some kind of clue in all the interviews, when his office phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the line sounded terrified, and he said he had a tip in the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning, he'd seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance and how the detectives were looking for her car, which the police had learned was a light blue Chrysler. And he said that just the day before, he and his wife had actually passed a car just like that on their morning run. It was abandoned on the side of the road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time, he and his wife had not gotten too close to the car, and they really hadn't thought much of it until they had seen this news report. And so after seeing the report just a few minutes ago, he and his wife had gone back to the desert to see if the car was still there. And he said not only was the car still there, but when they walked up close, they could see in the back seat what appeared to be a woman's body. Faust immediately wrote down the car's location, and when he looked at a map, he realized it was only about a half-mile away from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man, hung up the phone, and then he got in his car and he raced out toward the desert. And when he got past the edge of town into the open desert, he saw right up ahead a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He stopped his car on the shoulder near the car, he got out, and he approached the Chrysler, and he peered through the window, and almost immediately, he did see a woman's body. It was Bonnie's body, and she was slumped over in the back seat, just as the man had said. Bonnie's arms were bound behind her back, and there was a sock stuffed in her mouth, and the lower half of her body was naked. And for Faust, in seeing this, he wasn't surprised, but at the same time, he had held out hope that maybe Bonnie was alive. Just seeing her dead in such a horrible way in the back of this car it was heartbreaking. And so Faust went back to his car, he radioed the station, and he waited until a forensics team arrived. And then at that point, he went back over to the Chrysler, and he began to examine the body. Faust put on gloves, and he leaned into the car, and he lifted up Bonnie's head. And he found there were wounds all over her skull, as if she'd been repeatedly struck in the head with something very sharp. And her partial nudity made it seem likely that she was also sexually assaulted. There were also clear defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, which suggested she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a black light and began running it across the back seat of the car to check for potential DNA evidence. And Faust watched as the forensics officer ran the light over Bonnie's leg, and it lit up a spot. And the officer told Faust that almost definitely that spot was the killer's semen. And so he swabbed the area and put the swab into an evidence bag and told Faust that in a matter of maybe a few weeks, they should get the DNA profile back from the lab, and maybe they'd know who their killer was. In the meantime, the fingerprints found in Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and they'd come back with a match that really surprised Detective Faust. All the fingerprints and that bloody handprint on the pillow belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. And even though Faust really did not want to consider that a 13-year-old girl had in some way helped with a plot to kill her own mother, he now had to consider it, not only because of the handprint and fingerprints, but also because there was a long record of family problems inside of the Sanborn house. Now, obviously, Candace could not have committed this crime on her own, but she certainly could have helped whoever did. So Faust confronted Candace, and when he did, she just broke down sobbing. She said she had just been really scared and confused and was just looking in the bedroom for her mom and just didn't realize what she was doing by getting her prints everywhere. And looking at this scared teenager, Faust knew that Candace really didn't make sense as a potential suspect here. But he still felt like Bonnie's killer had to be somebody who knew Bonnie personally and had been in her house before. And there was one person who still had not been ruled out: Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Faust was sitting at his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. He was on hold and had been for some time, and as he tried to tune out the awful music that was playing on the line, he looked down at the handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers that were on his desk. Bonnie's husband, Robert, had been working in Maryland for the past couple of months, and he had not been scheduled to come back home to Tucson on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he claimed that he had been in Maryland that whole weekend, didn't mean he actually was. There were multiple flights from Maryland back to Tucson that in theory he could have secretly taken to come home, kill his wife, and then go back to work in time for his next shift. So Faust had compiled a list of every single flight Robert could have theoretically taken, and one by one he was calling the airlines to check the passenger manifests. And so far, there hadn't been a Robert Sanborn on any of the flights he had checked. And now he'd made it to the very last flight on that list. And just then, the on-hold music suddenly cut out, and the woman on the line told Faust that she had triple-checked, and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either, the one from Maryland to Tucson. And he thanked her, hung up, and sighed. Now, keep in mind, this took place before the events that happened on 9/11. Since 9/11, air travel has been much more rigidly controlled, especially in the United States. I mean, security is so much higher. But pre-9/11, that really wasn't the case. I mean, people didn't even necessarily have to show their ID to get on a domestic flight. And so Faust knew right now, even though he's being told that Robert's name didn't show up on the manifest of any of these flights, it didn't really rule him out, because he could have theoretically been traveling under a fake name. But there was a next step that would show if Robert had something to do with this, and that would be to ask Robert for a DNA sample, and hope that when the evidence came back from the lab, it would be conclusive enough to give a clear answer. One morning in early January of 1996, so about a month after Bonnie was murdered, Faust answered his office phone, and he heard a tech from the crime lab on the other end. In the past few weeks, there had been 5 more murders in the Tucson area that Faust and his team were now dealing with. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it actually took Faust a few seconds to remember which murder that was for. But once he remembered, he quickly sat down at his desk and he grabbed a pen to take notes. And he held his breath as the lab tech told him that they had tested the sample found on Bonnie's leg, and it was not a match for her husband Robert, nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbachevsky. Those brown buttons on Jason's shirt also didn't come back as matching the button that was found in Bonnie's bedroom, so it really was just a coincidence that they looked alike to the naked eye. Faust was disappointed, but he knew this was going to be a possibility, and he had a backup plan. He asked the lab tech to run the DNA sample against the DNA of every sex offender on the state registry to see if there was a match there. But as the crime lab slowly began doing that, they kept calling Faust to update him that they had not found a match yet. And eventually, the search for a DNA match ultimately just stalled, and Faust was pulled onto other cases. And so by that summer, it was looking like Bonnie's murder case might go cold. Then, after 9 months without any progress, an anonymous tip came in. That summer, in September of 1996, Detective Faust sat inside of an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had said that Lyle had sold drugs to several people in Bonnie's neighborhood, and he'd said some things about the case that the tipster thought were very concerning. And when Faust had dug through Lyle's records, he'd found that Lyle had a history of violent crimes involving knives. Sitting inside the interrogation room, Lyle seemed obviously nervous and very jumpy, and when Faust started asking him questions about Bonnie's murder, Lyle made excuses for the killer, saying that maybe the killer wasn't such a bad guy, maybe he was just, quote, on a bad trip. Now, Faust thought this was incredibly suspicious to be talking that way, so he asked Lyle for a DNA sample, and he got one, and he sent it off to the crime lab. And Faust had to wait several weeks for the results, and when they finally came in, Lyle Winstead was not a match. And at that point, Faust was feeling really frustrated. I mean, they'd already put in so much work with really nothing to show for it, and he didn't want the momentum on the case to die again. So before he put Bonnie's file back on the shelf, he decided to go back to square one and make sure there wasn't anything he just plain missed. The next month, between all the other cases he was working on, Faust found time to go literally door to door through Bonnie's neighborhood and re-interview everybody his team had already spoken to almost a year ago. Faust knew how gossip spread in quiet communities like this one, and even though nobody had been able to offer any leads the first time around, he wondered if maybe anything unusual might have surfaced since then. So he knocked on one door after another, and eventually, at a house down the street, a woman told him that she didn't know anything personally, but there was a rumor circulating around the neighborhood that he might want to look into. So Faust did. And after so many frustrating dead ends to this point, it was ultimately this rumor that did allow him to solve the case. based on that rumor, and also DNA and other evidence that was later uncovered, this is what police believe happened to Bonnie Sanborn on December 9th, 1995. Around 2:30 in the morning, Bonnie's killer watched her house from a hiding spot where nobody could see them. The killer knew the Sanborns had been trying to move to Maryland, but the killer felt like before they did go to Maryland, if they did that, there was something the killer had to do. Around 3 a.m., as the killer was watching the house, they saw the light in Bonnie's living room finally go dark. And then the killer saw some movement behind the curtains in one of the bedroom windows, and then that lamp went out, leaving the entire house completely dark. The killer had intentionally waited for this moment. They wanted to make sure that not just Bonnie, but her children were asleep by the time they went inside. And so now that the lights were off and that it seemed like the coast was clear, the killer grabbed their flex ties and also their chipping hammer and then began making their way towards the home. A chipping hammer is a very particular type of hammer that has a sort of typical one side that you would use to strike something, but the back of that hammer is sharp, almost like a pickaxe. And so with this barbaric tool they were about to use in hand, they slowly crept their way across Bonnie's backyard right up to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. And they found it was unlocked, just like they thought it would be. After all, they'd been to this house before. They sort of understood this one typically stayed unlocked. And they also knew what was on the other side of this door. It was Bonnie's bedroom. After sliding open the door, the killer stepped in and they found Bonnie asleep under the covers in her bed. And so thinking here was their chance, the killer began moving towards the bed. But as they stepped closer, a floorboard creaked and Bonnie stirred awake. And she rolled over and looked in the direction of the creaking sound and made eye contact with the killer, and the killer knew they had to strike. Bonnie tried to fight back, but it was no use. The killer completely overpowered her. Once Bonnie stopped struggling, but before she stopped breathing, the killer used those flex ties to bind her hands behind her back. Then, as she was laying there, unable to defend herself, they searched around for her purse, and when they found it, they dumped it out on the bed, and after they had emptied it, they found her car keys. And so they grabbed the keys, and then the killer picked up Bonnie, still very much alive, and they carried her out that sliding door into the backyard and then out into the garage. There, they used her car keys to unlock Bonnie's car, the blue Chrysler, and they put Bonnie in the back seat. Then they hopped in the driver's seat and they drove the car out into the desert where they parked on the side of the road. When the killer was done with Bonnie, they simply got out of the car and left it where it was and walked back into town. And as the sun began to rise, the killer wandered right back down Bonnie Street in the direction of the Sanborn house. It would turn out Detective Faust had been so focused on finding the killer amongst Bonnie's immediate family and friends that he really hadn't even considered somebody else who was literally physically closest to the Sanborns, her across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old Freddie Royval. Now, Freddie was not actually, emotionally close with the Sanborns, but he and his dad had, in the past, gone out of their way to help Bonnie, by doing some repair work at her house. But what Faust had learned when he had gone back and re-interviewed all the people on the street to see if he had missed something, one of the other neighbors, who was not remotely involved in what happened to Bonnie, told Faust that there was actually a rumor that Freddie had found Bonnie attractive. And there was also another rumor floating around that Faust learned that previously a woman had been assaulted by a younger man in this neighborhood and that maybe it was Freddie. Now, it's unknown if Freddie actually was the subject of that second rumor, but it was enough for Faust and the police to go collect DNA samples from every young man on the block, and wouldn't you know it, Freddie's DNA came back as a match. Freddie Royval was arrested in January of 1997, a little over a year after Bonnie's murder. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One day in the spring of 2006, A detective stood next to a refrigerator in her police station holding a container of evidence. She knew that what she was about to do with this evidence was a breach of protocol and could definitely get her in a lot of trouble. But that was not going to stop her. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the like button's laundry. But just fold all their dirty clothes and give it back to them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, Dr. John Yelnick finished up his final exam of the day at his dental practice in the rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed his patient a toothbrush and told her to come back in 6 months. Then he headed into his back office to pack up. Once he'd gathered up all his things, he walked out through the reception area and told the receptionist to have a great night. She waved and gave John a big smile. However, as soon as John actually left the building, the smile faded from his face, because in reality, he had a lot of problems right now, and pretending to be happy all day was actually really exhausting. And so John walked across the lot, climbed into his car, and then began the half-mile drive from his dental practice to his house. So John had actually grown up in Blairsville, and it had been his lifelong dream to raise a family here. So when he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have set up shop in a big city and very likely made a higher salary right off the bat. But instead, he joined the practice of his own childhood dentist right in downtown Blairsville. And it would actually turn out that John was able to make a lot of money right here in his hometown. This dental practice really took off, in part because John himself was really charming and great with kids, and so lots of families wanted to come here. And so what John had done is, with the extra money he was making, basically above and beyond what he expected, he took that extra money and invested it into real estate and became a millionaire by the time he was in his 30s. However, it was not until John met his wife, Michelle, that he really felt like he had made it in life. Michelle was a single mother with 2 children, and to John, this was actually perfect, because it meant that she came with a ready-made family. Now, John's friends were sort of worried that Michelle only wanted John for his money, but when John's mom got sick with cancer, Michelle took on the responsibility of being her full-time caregiver. And for John, that was all the proof that he ever needed that Michelle truly cared for him. And so the pair got married in 1997, and they actually adopted a little boy named JJ shortly after their marriage. And so altogether, they had 3 children. And together, this new big family moved into this big house with a pool and a hot tub. It was like everything was perfect. However, now, as John arrived back home and pulled into the driveway of his very modest home, and he sat there just staring at this new place he was currently living, he just thought to himself, like, how had everything fallen apart so completely? These days, John was very tight on money. He'd lent tens of thousands of dollars to a bunch of people because he was quite generous, but now he was having to ask for it back because he literally needed the money. And then on the marriage side, he and Michelle had hit this horrible rough patch that just didn't end, and they both admitted they had had affairs, and so now they were living separately, which was why John was here at this little house instead of coming home to the big family house with the pool and the hot tub. However, the financial stress and the marital stress, as bad as they were not nearly as bad as a third stressor in John's life. And that was that John was absolutely convinced that somebody was going to murder him. Now, this all started 2 weeks earlier when somebody vandalized John's car with spray paint. And the police looked into it, but they couldn't figure out who had done it. And, objectively, having your car spray painted, vandalized in some way does not, therefore mean someone's trying to kill you. But he just had this feeling that this felt really personal, like somebody was targeting him. And so eventually, over several days, John went from my car got vandalized to my car got vandalized and it makes me feel like someone's trying to kill me. And John believed this so completely that he actually went to his attorney and gave her $10,000 just in case he wound up dead.
she could use that to investigate his murder. Now, John got out of his car and he walked up his porch steps and into his home, and he closed the door and locked it behind him. And right away, John just felt like this house, it's already so depressing, but it was so quiet because nobody was here. I mean, he wished his adopted son JJ was here because he would have made the whole house just feel alive. But, these days, John didn't see JJ very much. He would go long stretches between visits. John took off his shoes and walked into the living room, and there on the coffee table, he saw a legal document that he had been avoiding. That document was a stack of divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, in 2003, but she and John had not been able to actually come to an agreement. Now, to be clear, they were not fighting to save the marriage. The marriage was done. Michelle was actually already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. However, what John and Michelle had been fighting over, which had caused this divorce to drag on, was JJ, their adopted son. Michelle wanted full custody, but John didn't want to give up his son. However, John knew in less than 24 hours, this would all finally be over. Their lawyers had finally settled on a shared custody agreement, and Michelle had already signed the paperwork, and tomorrow it would be John's turn to sign. And so John took a seat on the couch and turned on the TV. But he couldn't even focus, he was just too restless. So instead, he called his aunt, who he was very close to, and he talked with her for a while about the divorce and about the custody agreement. And then eventually, when they said their goodbyes, John hung up, he stretched out on the couch, and he fell asleep right there. The next day, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zach Hughes, who lived next door to John, walked out the front door of his parents' house and across the lawn towards John's house. Zach wanted to see if John's son, JJ, could come out and play. He wasn't sure if JJ would actually be around, since JJ did split time between his mother and his father's place, but, he figured it was worth a shot. But when Zach reached the front steps to John and JJ's house, he stopped because he saw there was this little glass panel to the left of the front door that had been broken, shattered. There was glass on the porch. And also, Zach could see streaks of what looked like red liquid that had dried underneath the broken panel. Immediately, Zach got scared. He sees this and thinks it's blood. He wants to turn and run away. But he thought about his friend JJ, and he was worried that maybe he was in some kind of trouble, so he couldn't just abandon him. And so, sort of mustering all the courage he could, Zach slowly and very nervously climbed the rest of the steps to the front door, and he tried the doorknob, but he found the door was locked. And so as carefully as he could, Zach actually reached his hand through that broken panel to the left of the door, being careful not to cut himself, and he reached inside the house and unlocked the door from the inside, and then he opened it up. And as soon as he stepped into the house, he saw there were papers strewn everywhere, and there was a body laying motionless on the floor, covered in blood. At that point, Zach turned around and he ran. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Leidick of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving with her husband and 4 children when she got a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally very quiet residential street, but the details were still a bit confusing. Dispatch just said there had been a cardiac arrest and that Corporal Leidick was needed at the scene. There was no other information available. So, thinking the call was sort of a run-of-the-mill heart attack, Leidick, with her family, just drove straight over there. However, when she actually pulled up to the home and got out of her vehicle, she could tell that this was not a heart attack. She saw there was a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch, and his face looked grim. Leidick walked over to him, and he immediately pointed out that broken glass and the blood that, appeared to be stained to the ground. And so she asked him, what's going on here? I was told this was a cardiac arrest. And all he said was, it's probably best if you just go in and look for yourself. So Leidick, she turned and waved to her husband and kids, sort of signaling everything's fine, just give me a minute. And then she stepped inside the house. And right away, she was sort of struck by what she saw. The whole foyer was splashed with blood all over the floor and the walls. And there, in the center of it, amongst, all these papers strewn about, was the most mutilated body she had ever seen. Now, Leidick had never actually worked a homicide before, but she knew, as she tried and failed to count the number of stab wounds on this man's body, that what she was looking at here was definitely not cardiac arrest. This was her very first murder case.
She also knew she needed backup because, this call had been recorded erroneously as a cardiac arrest, but what that meant is the police had not sent a full emergency response, and so Leidick and this other patrol officer were the only people on scene. Leidick was afraid the killer or killers could still be in the area, or maybe even in this house. They hadn't even secured the house yet. And she's thinking she brought her kids and her husband with her. So she immediately instructed the patrol officer to search the rest of the house, and then she went back out into the front yard to basically stand guard between the murder scene and her family with her hand on the gun in her holster. Luckily, though, it wasn't long before Leidick heard a bunch of emergency sirens approaching in the distance. Also, at the same time, that patrol officer came out of the house to tell Leidick that it was empty. So the killer or killers were gone. The only new discovery this officer had made was he had found a huge puddle of blood in the basement where the victim had bled through from the floor above. And so at this point, Leidick said bye to her husband and her kids, and she sent them home. And then she went back into detective mode and went back inside the house. It was around this point that somebody on scene told Leidick what the victim's name was. They said his name was John Yelnick. And so as the crime scene technicians began their work processing the physical evidence inside the house, Leidick began a slow walk through each of the rooms inside the home, trying to get a sense of who John was, and also how he died. John's body was close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that preceded his death had been very long and chaotic. There was blood all over the living room floor, which was also strewn with divorce papers. John's body was also found barefoot. However, there were bloody shoe prints in the house, and these prints were far too big to belong to that little boy who found the body, Zach. So Leidick figured they must belong to the killer or killers. And so the crime scene techs were already measuring the prints to try to determine the killer's shoe size. As Leidick continued walking through the house, she didn't see anything that at least overtly looked like it could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. The TV hadn't been taken, no drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened, and so on. And to Leidick, this actually made sense. I mean, the murder appeared to be extremely violent and so very likely quite personal, which suggested that whoever the killer was, or killers, the only thing they had really wanted when they entered this home was, apparently, for John to die horribly. She finished her sweep of the scene, ending up in the living room where it looked to her like the attack had begun. And that's when she noticed a check on the coffee table, right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to the victim, John Yelnick, for $15,000. And attached to the check was a note, asking John to hold off for a few days before he deposited it. The check and note were from somebody named Melissa Use. And when Leidick saw that, she did a double take. Use was the last name of the neighborhood boy, Zach, who had discovered John's body. And so Leidick wondered if Melissa Use was related to Zach Use, the boy. And so now Corporal Leidick realized that here on the coffee table, she had her first two legitimate leads. One, her victim was in the middle of a divorce. And someone, maybe his next door neighbor if Melissa was connected to Zach, owed him a lot of money that apparently she couldn't quite afford to pay back in one go, that she had to tell John to don't cash this right away. It was evening by the time Leidick finally stepped back outside the house, and when she did, she saw there was a group of neighbors and reporters jostling around each other out on the street. So Blairsville almost never had murders, and so Leidick knew this was obviously going to be a huge story. But for now, as much as she knew she was going to get hounded by reporters as she passed by them, she just needed to keep on walking because she had to get back to the station to get organized for interviews tomorrow, like with suspects. However, before she could even walk down the front steps, one of the other officers on scene came over to her with an update. Over the last few hours, the police had fanned out across the neighborhood to speak to people to see if anybody had seen or heard anything unusual. And the police had come back with two very interesting accounts. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 in the morning, so technically early that same morning, she had woken up to the sound of a scream. And so she sat up, she heard the scream, but she said the screaming didn't continue, and so she had ultimately just gone back to bed. The second account came from another neighbor who had also heard something around that same time the previous night. This neighbor said they heard a man yelling in what sounded like a very heated argument. Now, the neighbor couldn't make out everything the man was saying, but there was one sentence that was yelled very clearly, and that was, I'll never loan you money again. And so instantly, when Leidick heard that, she thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. Like, this seems to add more credibility to the idea that maybe money was behind this. However, the officer said he wasn't done. He said he had one more important piece of information for Leidick. In addition to the witness statements, a lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family in particular on the block that detectives really ought to look into. And that was the Use family. Because word around the neighborhood was that Melissa Use and John Yelnick had been having an affair. The following day, April 14th, Leidick was at the police station, sitting at a table inside of an interrogation room across from Melissa Use and her husband Tom. Now again, Leidick had never done a murder case before, but she was a very methodical investigator, and she had a plan for interrogating her persons of interest. First, she was going to go very hard at Melissa and Tom Use, even though they were not her top suspects. At this point, her top suspects were John's soon-to-be ex-wife Michelle and her new boyfriend Kevin, for the simple reason that in a murder case, from what she'd been told, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects number 1 and 2. The night before, Leidick had sent an officer to tell Michelle that her soon-to-be ex-husband was dead. But when the officer got to Michelle's house, she already knew, although she said that she had heard that John had died of a heart attack. So this officer had to break the news to Michelle and also her new boyfriend Kevin that this was actually a murder, and they both seemed genuinely shocked. Corporal Leidick actually knew Michelle's boyfriend Kevin personally because he was a state police trooper. They had actually worked together. But now, Leidick was going to have to investigate her colleague Kevin, because he's one of the suspects, which was obviously very touchy, especially amongst cops. And so what Leidick wanted to do was gather more information, before she spoke to Michelle and Kevin. First, what she wanted to do was rule the Uses out as suspects, and she wanted to also get the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled to take place later that day. So now, Leidick looked across the interrogation table at John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use. And Leidick began by asking them what the deal was with that $15,000 check Melissa had written to John that was found near his body. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since about 9th grade, and she was planning to open a new bakery in town. And John had just loaned her $15,000 to help her out with that. But then sort of out of nowhere, he'd asked for the money back. Melissa said she'd been really disappointed when he did this, but she also knew John was in the middle of a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She said that she had only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote the check. And so that's why she had also left that note for John along with the check, asking him not to cash it for a few days until she got that last $1,000 together. Leidick watched Melissa closely as she said all this. She did seem truly distraught over John's death, and that the money really didn't seem like a big issue to her at all, relative to John's death. But for Leidick, the obvious warmth that Melissa clearly felt for John raised another, more sensitive question here. And she decided that she really just couldn't dance around it, even though Melissa was literally sitting next to her husband, Tom. Leidick looked right at Melissa and asked her straight out, was she having an affair with John? Melissa immediately flushed and said no, and she said they'd been close friends, but really nothing more. At this point, Leidick turned to Melissa's husband, Tom, and just asked him the same thing. Was his wife having an affair with John? And for a second, Tom just went quiet. But then when he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He just seemed really nervous. And he basically refused to answer the question. And instead, he just kept repeating that he really had to go take care of his kids now. Now, Leidick knew this had been a very blunt thing to ask. But Tom's reaction to this question was really suspicious. And so by the time Leidick told Melissa and Tom that they could go, Tom had firmly established himself in Leidick's mind as a clear person of interest. Before Leidick left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her officers who she had sent to go observe John's autopsy. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined that the killer used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during the fight. In addition to the knife wounds, John's jugular had been cut by glass. And John also had defensive wounds on his hands, as well as cuts on his back, which suggested he had at one point tried to run away. I mean, Leidick already knew this, but to hear the details from the autopsy just reinforced how truly brutal this murder was. And so what Leidick thought after hearing these details was, wow, whoever did this must have truly hated John. And Leidick's already thinking, I already have one suspect in Tom Hughes, whose wife might have been having an affair with John. Certainly that would be enough to inspire Tom to hate John. Despite Leidick's, obvious inexperience with murder cases, she felt really confident at this point that she'd be able to solve this, as long as she was allowed to work slowly and methodically, like she always had on every case she'd worked in. However, the case was already getting a lot of attention in the news, and so Leidick knew there would be pressure to show results fast. If she moved too slowly, this case might either get taken away from her, or another police agency might get called in to help to speed it up. Now, Leidick didn't want that to happen, but she also really didn't want to compromise her methodical investigative process either, and so she figured she would have to strike a balance. That officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and tissue samples, which Leidick was supposed to send off to a state police lab for DNA testing. But Leidick decided, now that she had these samples, that she was not going to do that. Leidick really wanted to keep her investigatory options open and to guarantee that she knew every single thing going on with her evidence in this case. And so after Leidick got these samples and after this officer had left, she went to the department refrigerator and put them in there, and then she went home. The next day was April 15th, so 2 days after John Yelnick was murdered. By this point, Corporal Leidick had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members, and they'd painted John generally as a great guy and a very dedicated father. Today, Leidick was going to John's dental practice to talk to his colleagues to see if they had anything different to say. And as soon as Leidick arrived at John's office, she was glad she had decided to go there, because the dental hygienist and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Yelnick. And this was because during that long, multi-year fight John and Melissa had over their divorce, Michelle had at one point lodged allegations against John that he abused their adopted son, JJ. Even Michelle's own family had not believed her, and officials had declined to press charges. But at one point during the back and forth, Michelle had accused John of violating a stay-away order, and police had come and arrested him at work. And so John's colleagues thought Michelle was a total nightmare. She also called the office regularly to demand money, and John often caved and gave it to her. But actually, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, John had actually refused to speak to her. And this detail definitely caught Leidick's ear. It was not just the, colleagues at the dental practice that said Michelle was money hungry. A lot of John's friends said that. They said it was Michelle who wanted the big house with the pool and the hot tub. But John really had never felt comfortable with that, flashy lifestyle. And to many of John's friends and colleagues, it was that contrast between he and Michelle that ultimately sort of drove them apart. And so Leidick began to wonder, maybe John and Michelle had a fight about money a few days before his murder, where Michelle's calling, trying to demand money. John's not taking her call. Could that have been enough to inspire Michelle to murder John? Maybe. But also what Leidick discovered is that Michelle was actually listed as a beneficiary of John's life insurance plan. And so if John died, she stood to inherit literally millions of dollars. And so now there's like a twofold financial reason for Michelle to want to bring harm to John, basically all because of money. But it didn't seem possible that Michelle would be capable of overpowering John and delivering all those stab wounds and killing him. It just seemed like John would be able to fight her off if she was the killer. But Leidick thought, maybe Michelle hired somebody else to do it, somebody else that was much larger and more physical. She certainly had the money to do that. And so as Leidick left the dental office, she began to think about how she was actually going to approach Michelle. Given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop, Leidick did not want to make her move too soon without enough ammunition first. This was not just the first murder case she had worked. This was, the first murder case and the biggest case, period, that she had ever worked. Reporters were calling her constantly. This was a really big deal, and she didn't want to screw anything up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, so 6 days after the murder. And Corporal Leidick knew that his friends and family were already beginning to get pretty antsy about why the investigation seemed to be moving so slowly. But, Leidick did understand where they were coming from. From day one, there was an enormous amount of media pressure, just very public pressure to solve this thing right away. And so that was weighing on friends and family. And also, John himself, before he was killed, had this paranoia that he was going to be murdered. And now he's turned up dead. It just seemed like a crazy coincidence, or that John knew something, that this really was a prediction that came true. But Leidick also felt like John's friends and family just didn't understand why this was taking the time it was taking. She wasn't just being slow, she was being careful. That was her way. Without any real departmental guidance on how to actually work a homicide, Leidick had developed a very, careful method of her own. And for the next several months, Leidick continued to follow her protocol, and she did take her time, but again, with intention. The crime scene unit had not turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the crime scene, and the bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of Leidick's suspects. And so for now, Leidick was really relying heavily on interviews. And Leidick, she would run down every single tip and rumor that she could find, systematically ruling things out one by one. And as she did this, she always kept tabs on her three best suspects, Tom Huse, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnick. But she made no move to arrest any of them. Sometimes the complaints from the public and from John Yelnick's own family about, her failure to solve this case more quickly did get to her, but she was determined to manage the case her way. She felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Huse, so John's alleged affair partner and next-door neighbor, hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, so about 3 months after the murder, when Leidick got a call from Melissa. Leidick had actually been pretty surprised to hear from her, and then even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. And then when Leidick showed up, Melissa was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing on the sidewalk with these two older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said that she had met them at a psychic tea party, and they had visions about the case. And Leidick was really not happy about this. And she was even less happy to learn that John's own family had given permission for the psychics to enter John's house. But Leidick also knew that John's family was getting really edgy, and if she wanted more time to work on her case, she needed to placate them. If that meant working with these psychics contacted by one of the suspects' wives, then that was what Leidick was going to do. And so Leidick followed Melissa and the psychic sisters as they walked into John's front yard and began saying they felt hot and cold patches, and, Leidick is doing her best not to roll her eyes. And then when they went into the house, which had not been cleaned out after the murder and so was still splattered with blood, the psychic sisters had a premonition that told them the killing had happened in the dining room area. And then the psychic said they saw a knife and they saw stab wounds and a bloody footprint, and they said the killer drove a black or red car, and that the killer was not Melissa Huse's husband, Tom. Now, Melissa, as she listened to the psychic speak, she seemed really excited by this, but Leidick thought it was all ridiculous. The blood that they were literally looking at inside the home made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened. And the details of John's death and the huge police investigation that followed had been all over the news. And so the things the psychics were saying were easy to learn before showing up here. These are not revelations. And the fact that these psychics, who Melissa herself had brought here and hired, were now exonerating Melissa's husband was not very convincing. And so as the group finally left the house, the only thing Leidick thought these psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off her slow but steady investigation. She knew that at this point, John Yelnick's family had lost faith in her. But what they didn't know is she still had one more thing she wanted to try. She just had to wait for the right time to use it. Fast forward to February of 2007, so 10 months after the murder. And at this point, Corporal Leidick finally got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office to take over the investigation. Leidick's cooperation with those psychics had bought her a little time, But ultimately, both John's family and Melissa Hughes had gotten more and more agitated by Leidick's very slow pace. They felt like the psychics had basically given them as much information as the police had, and the Attorney General ultimately agreed, which meant Leidick was losing her case. And on the one hand, this was quite literally the exact thing that Leidick had been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over her investigation. But on the other hand, the Attorney General's office was not the agency that Leidick had expected. And so now, even though this definitely stung, Leidick realized that she could actually finally make that play she'd been sitting on for almost a year. And so Leidick went to that refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and took out that little container of fingernail clippings and other tissue samples from John Yelnick that her officer had brought to her after John's autopsy. She had been told she needed to send these samples off to the state police crime lab pretty much right away, but she hadn't. In a total breach of protocol, Leidick had decided to not do that and instead put these samples in the fridge and wait. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in and getting involved in this case, it sort of made the case way more high profile, which in turn allowed Leidick to send these samples not to the state police crime lab, but to the FBI crime lab, a higher rung on the hierarchy. Now, normally the FBI would never take samples from sort of a small town murder case, but now that it was this huge public case, national news, Leidick knew she could take advantage. So she repackaged those fingernail clippings and the other samples, and she sent them off to the FBI, and she waited. The day the results came back in, Leidick was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email with the DNA results, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was reading, because her strategy of intentionally slow playing this investigation and sitting on this evidence until right now had totally paid off. Finally, Leidick on her computer was looking at the name of John's killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and tested by the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to John Yelnick in the early morning hours of April 13th, 2006. Around 12:30 a.m., the killer drove their red car onto a quiet residential street in Blairsville. They eventually came to a stop in front of a modest brick home. There, they cut their lights. The killer climbed out and looked around the neighborhood to make sure no one was watching, but it was dark and silent. So, the killer left the street and walked around to the back of this home and then slipped inside of it through an unlocked back door. Once inside, the killer walked through the dining room and then into the living room where they found John Yelnick sleeping on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist, and they walked right up to John, and they raised the blade up and then brought it down directly onto John. Instantly, John woke up and began screaming, and he put his hands up to try to protect himself, and he even tried clawing at the killer, getting the killer's skin under his fingernails. And so John eventually rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. John eventually got up and sort of began to stumble away, but the killer chased him down, and the two began to wrestle. And as they're struggling and the killer is stabbing John, John's flailing his arms around, and he eventually hit the divorce papers on the coffee table, throwing them everywhere. And then eventually, somehow, just on pure adrenaline, John broke away from the killer and tried to run for the front door. John eventually did make it to the front foyer, and he actually reached for the front door, but the killer actually shoved John as he did that, and John went flying towards that pane of glass to the side of the door, and his head went through the glass, and when his head went through, some of the glass severed his jugular, and then John bled to death right there. The killer watched until John was totally still. At that point, they walked back out of the home, tracking John's blood right back out the door. The killer was very confident they would never be caught, primarily because the killer knew people trusted them with their lives. The killer was Michelle's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley. And the fact that he was a cop was the very reason Corporal Leidick had decided not to send all of that evidence to the state police crime lab. Leidick knew Kevin, and she liked him, and she basically trusted him. But as soon as her investigation began, she began to hear about how much Kevin seemed to hate John, in part because of the allegations that Michelle had made that John had abused JJ. Even though those allegations were ruled totally unfounded, it seemed that Kevin ultimately believed them. And so Lydic had become increasingly paranoid that Kevin was the killer, and that her case would be taken over not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was afraid that if Kevin was guilty here, well, she couldn't really trust the state police crime lab to not potentially cover up evidence. Or maybe Kevin would get involved, find out, and he would cover it up. It just was too risky. And so she didn't want to send the evidence to the state crime lab. So Lydic had done something really risky. To keep complete control over her investigation, she'd kept the fingernails and all the tissue samples that were collected at the autopsy, even though she knew they very likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then she slow-played her investigation, biding her time, until she could figure out what to do with those samples. And luckily, the answer came about a year later when the Attorney General took over the case, and Lydic then got access to the FBI crime lab. The FBI scientists did finally test the DNA that was found under the fingernails and found that it was a match for Kevin Foley. And so in the end, State Trooper Kevin Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Michelle Yelnick, she was never actually charged in connection with the case.
Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never-before-heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In today's episode, I'm going to tell you two stories. In the first story, it's ultimately about this person who is so set on making a change in their lives that they take drastic measures to effect that change, with some very unfortunate consequences. The second story is about this town in California where there was this perceived threat, and it was sort of normalized and people were not that worried about it until it totally spiraled out of control. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and write on their bathroom mirror, "I'm watching you" in red lipstick. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Early in the morning on February 5th, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlinok stood in the kitchen of her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment making some coffee. Mornings were the best part of Laverne's day because she had the whole apartment to herself. Now, she lived with her boyfriend, John Sosnovsky, but he worked at a nearby mill and had to be out early in order to catch the bus there. And each time he left, Laverne felt like a huge weight lifted off of her. Because when John wasn't home, Laverne could go about her day and pretend she was safe. But that's all it was pretend. John, in reality, was an incredibly violent man. I mean, he was seriously physically abusive, especially when he was drunk, which was basically all the time. So Laverne had actually been married, but her husband had died of cancer, and she had ultimately met John following her husband's death. And so when they met, Laverne was very vulnerable and lonely, and she really hadn't realized the kind of person John was until it was too late. It had been 10 years now, and Laverne still had not, built up the courage to leave him. I mean, the reality was she was just scared of how he would react, and so she sort of felt trapped. Now, she sat down at her kitchen table with her coffee,
and she opened up the local paper. And as soon as she did, the first thing she saw was a big black and white photo of a smiling young woman who likely was in her 20s. The photo was connected to an article about a recent murder that happened 30 miles away, just northeast of Portland. The victim had been identified as a woman named Tanya Bennett, and Tanya Bennett was the girl in the photo. The article said she had been beaten and then also strangled with a rope, and then she had been left on the side of the highway. And when Laverne read about the area she actually had been, dumped, she realized it actually was only about 1.5 miles down from this famous scenic overlook that Laverne had actually been to before. Like, she was familiar with this area. And so Laverne, she's reading the article and she's looking at this picture back and forth, and it was like something was sort of forming in her mind. She just had like this weird sense that she knew something about this case. And then as she stared at this photo for a little bit longer, it's like it all came together. And she realized almost certainly that she knew John very likely killed this woman. And so even though she loved her peaceful, quiet mornings with her coffee, Laverne immediately stood up, she grabbed the phone, and she called the police. After she hung up with police, Laverne was very shaken up. I mean, her heart was still racing. I mean, this was a very risky thing she was doing, because she had no way of knowing if what she had just given authorities was enough to arrest John. If it wasn't, it was entirely possible that John would discover this betrayal of her calling the police about him, implicating him in a murder, and he would probably just continue his abuse, if not amp up his abuse of Laverne. And so the way she saw it is either what she just did was going to end the chapter with John and he was going to go to jail for murder, or Laverne might wind up being the next dead girl on the side of the highway. A little over a week later, on the morning of February 16th, Detective John Ingram sat with his partner in a very clean living room in Wilsonville, Oregon. Ingram was the lead investigator on Tanya Bennett's murder case, and he was there to speak to Laverne, who was sitting on the opposite couch. And Laverne seemed really nervous and kept fidgeting constantly and offering Ingram and his partner refreshments. It was just very clear that there was a lot on this woman's mind. So Ingram knew that Laverne had a week earlier called in a tip about the victim's killer. She thought it was her own boyfriend, John Sosnowski. And right now, Ingram was very eager to hear what she had to say about her boyfriend, to basically elaborate and sort of give the full story of why she believed what she believed, in part because Ingram's case so far had absolutely no other leads. Like, this was it. The victim's body had been found on a grassy slope so close to the edge of the highway that you could see her from the road. But Ingram and his partner had not been able to find any witnesses. A few people had claimed to have seen Tanya along with some man at a bar earlier in the night before she went missing, but no one had been able to effectively describe that man. It was just some guy she was with. And so Ingram and his partner had basically talked to just about anyone they could think of that might have known Tanya. They'd canvassed her neighborhood, they'd interviewed her family, coworkers, friends, and they still had not been able to find anybody who fit as a suspect. They also hadn't found any good physical evidence at the scene, like fingerprints or helpful forensics. So now Ingram was hoping that Laverne was going to be the key to his whole case. And so eventually Ingram looked at Laverne and said, "Whenever you're ready, tell me what you know. Tell me the story of why you believe John killed Tanya." Now, at first, Laverne just continued to squirm in her seat, and she was, obviously very nervous, but eventually, after Ingram told her to just, take a breath, calm down, it's okay, we just want to hear your story, eventually, with a shaking voice, she told them that on the night of the murder, John had come home around maybe 1 or 2 in the morning and immediately got in the shower. Now, this was unusual. I mean, this is not something that he typically did. He didn't shower at 2 in the morning, but Laverne really hadn't thought much of it until the next day when they went to a local bar, and she'd literally overheard John bragging to somebody about murdering Tanya, describing how he had picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then took her to the highway by Columbia River Gorge to dump her body by this scenic overlook. As Laverne spoke, Ingram and his partner were shocked. Basically, Laverne had overheard effectively a confession, and the details of that confession did seem to line up with what they had heard so far. Tanya had been seen out late at night with some man, although nobody could really describe the man. And also where her body was found, it was near the scenic overlook, something that was, publicly known, but still, that's what Laverne heard John say,
it lined up. But he kept a poker face and just told Laverne to please keep going, keep elaborating. And so Laverne, she continued speaking, and she went on to say that the reason she didn't come forward right away was because she was scared of John. He was a violent alcoholic who abused her, which is also part of the reason why this seemed real to her. I mean, she was totally not shocked at the idea that maybe John killed someone, but she was basically fearful that he might kill her too. And so she had kept it to herself until she had seen the article in the paper and also saw the picture of the girl, and she just looked so young and innocent, and she just couldn't help but feel like she owed it to that girl to come forward. Now, at this point, Ingram's mind was whirling. I mean, if this was all true, it was huge for this case. I mean, potentially, this just solved the whole murder. I mean, this is what happened potentially. But he also knew, right now, it was just one woman's story. He needed actual proof. He couldn't just take Laverne's word for it. So he asked Laverne if he and his partner could just go ahead and search the apartment. And as soon as Laverne nodded, the detectives jumped to their feet and got to work. Laverne led the detectives down the hallway to the master bedroom, and then from there, she backed off and just, let the men get to work. And the detectives, they immediately split up and spread out to cover more ground. Ingram had actually brought along a list of stuff that they were theoretically looking for. And one of the things on his list was a swatch of denim from the front buttons of Tanya's jeans. It had been missing when they found her, like it had been intentionally cut out, which was obviously pretty unusual. And it made him think that Tanya's killer had taken a trophy or something. But after a few minutes of searching around the bedroom, Ingram did not see this denim patch. In fact, he actually didn't see anything at first glance that connected John to Tanya. Until he went over to look through this cardboard box of papers and began sifting through them. And when he pulled out a torn piece of scrap paper and read what was on it, he froze. On this piece of scrap paper was a handwritten message that just said, quote, "T. Bennett, good peace." Ingram immediately called his partner over, who walked over and looked at the note, and both of them are like, okay, obviously, we need to bring John in right away for a chat. But after leaving the bedroom and walking towards the door to leave, who comes in the front door? None other than John Sosnovsky. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballenstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballenstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. Again, that's fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. About an hour later, Ingram sat at an interrogation table in the sheriff's office, staring across it at John. And John had a very confused look on his face, but otherwise seemed relatively calm. Back at the apartment, when John had walked in the door and sort of saw the detectives and didn't know what was going on, Ingram had told him who he was and why he was there, and John had really just seemed surprised, but had quickly agreed to go with them to the station if they wanted to speak to him. But Ingram knew from experience that, just because John was acting very cooperative did not mean he was innocent. Now, Ingram slid a picture of Tanya across the table and asked John if he knew who she was or had anything to do with her murder. And John didn't deny it or act horrified or offended to be asked. He just said he didn't really remember. And when Ingram showed him the note they found in his bedroom that said T. Bennett, good peace on it, John just sort of squinted at it and said he really wasn't sure if he wrote that or not. So these were all very straightforward questions, and it was highly suspicious to Ingram that John apparently just couldn't answer them, at least not cleanly. And really the rest of his interview went the same way, with John giving mostly just vague non-answers to everything Ingram asked, no matter how binary the question was supposed to be. And Ingram was just sort of struck by how nonchalant John seemed whenever he responded, even though, he was being questioned about his connection to a murder. This was not a time to be nonchalant. This was a time to be forthcoming. However, despite Ingram's very high suspicion of John, realistically, the only evidence he had on John, at least at this point, was all circumstantial, and so was not nearly enough to actually arrest John. What they needed in order to do that was some form of hard evidence that directly connected him to Tanya's murder. So ultimately, at the end of this interview, despite how weird the whole thing had been, Ingram just sighed and told John that for now, he could go. 4 days later, Ingram had just gotten to his office for the morning when his desk phone rang. He picked up and was surprised to hear Laverne's voice on the other end. But before he could ask her what this was about, Laverne told him she had found something in her car that morning and felt like he needed to see it. And when she told him what this thing was, Ingram said he would be right over. Then he immediately hung up and ran to find his partner. As he drove to Laverne's, he found his heart was racing. Over the last few days, they hadn't found any additional evidence to prove John was their killer. In fact, if anything, they had actually lost some evidence, since that note they found inside of John's things in his house ended up being a dead end, because their analysts couldn't actually match the handwriting to John, so they didn't know for sure if it was him. But now, based on what Laverne had just told him on the phone about what she found in her car, he was pretty much positive that this was the break he needed. Within the hour, Ingram and his partner were standing in Laverne's garage with Laverne staring into the open trunk of her car. Laverne had told Ingram that she kept her car and really her whole life very, very clean, like her apartment's clean, everything's clean all the time. And when she went into her car that day, she noticed there was a little swatch of denim sitting in the trunk. And she knew that she had not put it there, and considering she was sort of on high alert about John and about his connection to this murder, it just seemed like something worth flagging to police. And for Ingram and his partner, as they're staring into the trunk at this little swatch of denim that looks very much like the swatch of denim they were secretly looking for, they had not publicly revealed that the killer had taken a little swatch of denim from Tanya's jeans. That was private. They're looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, like this is the break we needed. Clearly, that's the denim from Tanya's jeans. And so Laverne was right to call this in. This is potentially huge. Now, obviously, Ingram knew that they would still have to get this denim tested to make sure it really was Tanya's. It's entirely possible that it was actually Laverne's or John's or was unrelated, but circumstantially, this felt like hitting the jackpot. And so Ingram watched as his partner picked up the swatch, put it into an evidence bag, and then they left and said they would have it tested and they would be in touch. The following morning, Ingram was at his desk reviewing all the evidence that they had so far. And by this point, they had a lot of evidence. The previous night, after finding the denim, they had brought John in for a polygraph test, and he had completely failed it. The test administrator had even noted that, in his opinion, John definitely knew what had happened to Tanya. So now, realistically, Ingram was just sort of waiting on confirmation that that fabric was a match. And then at that point, they could go and arrest John. And when Ingram's phone rang, he picked it up immediately, and it was the lab. And so Ingram sat up straight, ready for some good news, but the tech on the other line sounded sort of glum, and he told Ingram that the denim from Laverne's car did not match the jeans that Tanya was wearing, so it was not hers. And at this, Ingram was just completely stunned. The idea that they had just found the same unique cut of denim in a car in their main suspect's house could not be a coincidence. It was not typical for people to have little swatches of denim lying around. Like, this is not something that you just happen to have. It felt sort of specific. And so there just had to be more to this than met the eye. And even though Ingram tried to work out some kind of reasonable explanation for why that swatch was there, the only thing that actually made sense was that the fake denim was planted there. And so feeling a mix of, again, shock, but also just frustration here. He thought he was so close to solving this thing, and now he was sort of back to square one. Ingram realized that the next stop had to be Laverne's. He needed to go speak to her again. Later that morning, Ingram and his partner were once again back in Laverne's living room with a very nervous-looking Laverne sitting across from them. This time, Ingram was going to be a little tougher on her. because he now knew that, whatever she had told him before very likely was not the full story. And as soon as Ingram asked Laverne point blank if she had planted that evidence, that denim inside of her car, Laverne just kind of looked back at him and her face began to sort of quiver, and then she just started sobbing. And she told him she was so sorry. She explained that she had cut up some jeans and put that front button part in her car and pretended to have found it so that they'd be able to arrest John. She said she had just gotten so worried when they let him go after interviewing him because she knew John killed Tanya. He had to have. She heard him talk about it. Like, he did it and he's dangerous. And she just wanted to make sure the police held him accountable. Now, when Ingram heard this, he could hear the earnestness in her voice. Like, clearly this woman is scared of John and thinks he did this. She believes he did this. And so he wanted to believe her angle here, as inappropriate as planting evidence was. But, critically, he knew Laverne Still was definitely not telling him everything, because there was simply no way she could have known to plant that unique cut of the jeans unless she had intimate knowledge of the crime or some other inside information. But there was just something missing here. Why would she randomly choose that front cut of denim as just the evidence? Oh, here's some evidence that's going to make John look guilty. Why would she choose that? That's way too on the nose. And when he pointed this out to Laverne, it was like Laverne's energy completely shifted, from sobbing and sadness and remorse to just pure hesitation. Like, she didn't really know how to react, but there wasn't any more sadness. It was like, uh-oh, something's off here. And then Laverne kind of took a deep breath and she looked at Ingram and she said, I was lying. You're right. My story about planting the evidence, that was a lie. But she went on to say that the reason she had lied was because she had ultimately been too afraid that if the police knew the whole story, that she would get in trouble too. Then Laverne explained what really happened to Tanya. On the night that Tanya was murdered, Laverne said John called her that night and he was sort of frantic. And he said to her that he was in trouble and that she needed to meet him at the bar that he was at and to bring along a shower curtain. And so Laverne said, because she was very scared of John and was just fearful of asking any questions, she had just done what he said. And she got the shower curtain and she had driven out there and she found John in a parking lot standing over a body. It was Tanya. And she was just lying there on the ground, motionless. Laverne said she was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she just helped. She literally helped John put Tanya's body into her car, Laverne's car, wrapped her up in that curtain she'd brought along, and then together they dumped her body at a spot along the highway. But as Laverne continued to talk, her story suddenly got much darker because she actually eventually confessed that actually Tanya had not been dead when she had first arrived, but instead she was still clinging to life. And at John's request, Laverne had tied rope around Tanya's neck and held it tight while John sexually assaulted her. Laverne said after he was done, Tanya was no longer breathing. Ingram could barely conceal his shock when she explained this. I mean, here was this gentle, soft-spoken lady who was now telling him that she had actively participated in the sexual assault and murder of this young woman. It was hard to wrap his head around it. And at the moment, all Ingram could think was, this can't be real. But what Laverne was saying just fit. It explained John's cagey answers to his questions, his failed polygraph, and how Laverne knew the right part of the jeans to cut out and fake as evidence, because she and John had been the ones who actually made the cut on Tanya's jeans. They knew. But despite getting this earth-shattering confession here, Ingram wanted to be completely sure that this version of the story Laverne was telling him was actually the truth, and he knew exactly how to prove it. The following day, Ingram was behind the wheel of his cruiser next to his partner, and Laverne sat in the back, sort of absent-mindedly staring out the window. They were driving down the highway northeast of Portland, and Ingram had instructed Laverne to let him know when they reached the spot where they dumped Tanya's body. Now, the newspapers had published the general location of where the body had been found, but certainly not specifics. So Ingram knew that if Laverne could point out the exact spot, well, that meant she was telling the truth. As they began to get closer and closer to the spot Ingram knew was the spot. He sort of felt his heart rate pick up, but he didn't drive any faster or slower. He didn't signal that it was coming up. He just kept on driving, steady, going straight, sort of expecting Laverne to call it out any moment. But the cruiser drove right past the actual spot where the body had been found, and Laverne didn't say anything. For a few minutes, they just kept on driving down the road in total silence, and Ingram's feeling really disappointed here. And as they're driving along, suddenly Laverne says, "Hey, wait a minute, turn around." So Ingram did, and soon they were headed back the way they'd come. And this time, when they passed the actual crime scene, so the actual spot where Tanya had been found, Laverne called it out and said that's where she was. Stop. As Ingram parked the car, he looked back at Laverne, who was staring intently out the window, right at the exact spot on that slope right off the highway where the body had been found. Then, once they were parked, all three of them got out of the car, and Laverne went over to the edge of the road and pointed, like right to the exact spot where Tanya had been found on this slope. And even though Ingram tried to keep his expression neutral here, internally he was sort of amazed. I mean, clearly Laverne was telling the truth. It would have been impossible for her to have chosen that specific spot without having prior knowledge of where Tanya had been, meaning she was telling the truth. She must have been involved in killing Tanya. As they all climbed back into the car, Ingram knew they now had more than enough to formally arrest John and also Laverne. She'd done the right thing by coming forward, but of course now there were going to be consequences. On February 21st, so 16 days after Laverne called with her first tip, John Sosnovsky was arrested. And 5 days after that, Laverne was arrested as well, and both of them were charged with murder. About 11 months later, Laverne's trial started, and at that point, Laverne actually tried to change her story again. She tried to recant her confession and said, "No, I didn't actually do this." But the jury didn't buy her change of heart and convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. As for John, 2 months after Laverne's sentencing, he was given the same sentence, life in prison. And that should have been the end of the case, at least from the legal perspective. But for the next 3 years following sentencing, Ingram just couldn't stop thinking about Laverne and John and Tanya Bennett. Despite what Laverne had done, he felt a lot of empathy for her. She'd obviously been under John's control and had seemed genuinely terrified of him. But more than that, Ingram had this horrible, nagging feeling that they'd gotten something wrong here. Then, one March afternoon in 1994, Ingram was in his office at the sheriff's department going over some paperwork when his desk phone rang. When he picked it up, it was the prosecutor who'd worked Tanya's case. And the prosecutor said they'd just gotten a very strange letter about Tanya's murder. And as soon as the prosecutor described the letter's contents, Ingram felt sick to his stomach. Ingram had been right to worry that he and his partner and really the whole legal system had potentially just gotten something wrong with this case. It just felt like there was something left unsaid. There was some loophole, there was some loose end, something, but he didn't know what it was. It would turn out the thing that was wrong was Laverne, because their star witness, Laverne, was not just this sweet older lady afraid of her abusive boyfriend who had come forward and told the truth despite the consequences. That wasn't really the story. In fact, basically everything she told Ingram and his partner was a lie. What was true, and what ultimately drove Laverne to do what she did, was she really wanted to break up with John, but she didn't know how to do it. And so what she ultimately did to attempt to rid herself of John was to frame him for murder. And at first, she did an incredible job. She read everything she could, little details about the murder in the news. She also snuck a peek at Ingram's list of evidence during that early interview that was done at her apartment. And so that's how she knew about, that swatch of denim they were looking for. And she also just happened to take a few really lucky guesses. Like when she pointed out the spot on the side of the highway where the body was found, she just guessed, but it happened to be right. However, the problem was, despite, basically nailing the framing of John and getting him wrapped up with a murder conviction, she also sort of inadvertently implicated herself. When she came out and said, "Well, I participated in the murder," her thinking was, they'll take pity on me and they'll blame John, he'll go to jail and I'll be okay. But no, she also got convicted of murder and went to jail as well. And Laverne and John were literally in prison, basically riding out their life sentences, when the actual killer, the real Tanya Bennett killer, sent a letter to authorities confessing to his crime. That was why that prosecutor called Ingram. It was to tell him, like, I think there's been a mistake. They clearly didn't do it. After the real killer was arrested in 1995, Laverne and John were both released from prison. In total, they both served 4 years in jail, all because of Laverne's lies. One morning in early November of 2023, a 71-year-old woman named Patrice Miller stood in front of her fridge in her little home in the rural town of Downeyville, California. And she saw she was running low on food, which meant it was time to place an order with the market in town, which delivered her groceries for her. Getting her food delivered was essential for Patrice and where she was at in her life right now. She lived alone and had a whole house to take care of, which was definitely getting harder the older she got. She'd also had some health problems lately, so it was getting more difficult just to move around. She even had a walking stick just to prop herself up. As Patrice stood in front of her fridge, wondering what she was going to add to her grocery list, she heard one of her 2 cats meowing outside. And this reminded her that amongst some other chores, she needed to feed her cats. So she decided to make her list later, and she just closed the fridge door, put some cat food in a bowl, and then grabbed her walking stick and headed outside. Patrice carried the cat food out onto the porch. She had some other things to do outside, but she couldn't hold a lot of things at once because of her walking stick. So once she had put the bowl down, she then headed back inside to get her compost, and then took that back outside to her garden. And she tried to do all these outdoor chores really quickly because she didn't like being outside these days. She had lived in Downeyville for a long time, but over the past few years, it had gotten really dangerous there. Now, she hadn't realized how bad it was at first because she mostly kept to herself, but eventually she learned that her neighbors were starting to get intruders on their property. There had also been a clear uptick in vandalism in people's yards and to their homes. And in fact, over the past few months, Patrice herself had begun to experience this directly. In fact, she had dealt with so many attempted break-ins at her own house that she had become convinced that she had a stalker. She'd even put bars on her windows as a security measure. So that's why Patrice did not like being outside. She felt exposed, like her stalker or whoever it was that was doing this was going to be watching her and would come over here and attack. And so as fast as she could, she dumped the compost in her garden, turned around, hustled inside, and shut the door behind her. And as soon as she had done that and was safely inside her house, she felt hugely relieved. A few days later, on November 8th, at the market in town where Patrice typically got her groceries, a 55-year-old cashier named Cassie Koch rang up a customer at the register. But as she bagged their purchases, her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Patrice. Cassie was typically the person that delivered Patrice's grocery order, but over the years, they had become closer than just a customer-provider relationship. They were friends. In fact, these days, the two of them would speak on the phone fairly often, just to chat. But now, Cassie realized she hadn't heard from Patrice in days, which was very odd, both because of their friendship, but also because she knew it had been a while since Patrice made her grocery order. And so Cassie had begun asking around at the store and had found out that nobody else had heard from Patrice either. Now, Cassie knew it was possible that Patrice was just busy, and for pretty much anybody else, one missed order or even a couple missed orders wouldn't be enough to make Cassie worry. But in this case, Cassie was extra concerned because she knew about Patrice's stalker. And she knew that Patrice had even called the authorities about it, but there really hadn't been much help. Remember, this is a tiny rural town in California that had experienced a lot of exactly what Patrice was experiencing. Break-ins, harassment, and other kinds of vandalism or damage. However, neither Patrice nor anybody else had reported any actual violence. So authorities were basically overwhelmed with a flood of what they considered sort of relatively minor complaints. And Patrice's situation really didn't seem much worse than anybody else's in town. And also officials just didn't have the manpower to deal with it. And so ultimately, all authorities did was just advise Patrice on ways she could handle it herself, which was why she'd installed those bars on her windows. All this is to say, Cassie knew that Patrice was genuinely terrified of her stalker. who Patrice referred to as Big Bastard. And she was worried about what the stalker might do next. So after Cassie was done with her shift that day, she tried to get in touch with Patrice one more time. But when she couldn't reach her yet again, Cassie called the police and asked them to go do a wellness check. That evening, a deputy from the Sierra County Sheriff's Department drove up to Patrice's house and parked in front. And immediately, he could tell something was wrong. The front door of her house was clearly smashed in, and there was a garden hose that was laying across her porch steps and was spraying water everywhere, like the water had just been left on. And so the deputy got out of his cruiser and he walked over to the house and he found the turnoff for the water on the side of the house. And then he walked up the front steps of the porch. And as he did this, he was constantly looking around and listening, trying to figure out what was going on here. I mean, he didn't know if there was an active threat inside the house. He had no idea what he was walking into. And so he's on the porch, and before going in through the front door, which was obviously, smashed open, he looked in a window to see if he could see into the house to gauge what was going on here. And when he looked inside the house, the first thing he saw was blood all over the floor. And at that point, he unholstered his gun. And so now, with his gun raised, the deputy stepped into the house. And he slowly walked through the living room, listening for any signs of sudden movement or an indication there was someone still in the house. But he didn't hear anything. And so there didn't appear to be an intruder present right now. But there was also no sign of Patrice. All he saw was that blood towards the front of the house. That was it. And so the deputy, he left the living room and walked towards the kitchen. And as soon as he stepped across the threshold into the kitchen, he breathed in and just kind of held his breath because what he saw was just chaos. All the cabinets were open, and all over the floor were remnants of all the food that likely was in the cabinets, like pieces of food and ripped up packaging and broken jars. A window at the far end of the room was also smashed, and the security bars that Patrice had put on the window were bent and hanging by their hinges. There was actually so much just debris and just chaos in the kitchen that at first, the deputy didn't register what was actually laying in the center of the kitchen on the floor. But then, when his brain sort of processed it, he realized what he was looking at was Patrice. At least, what was left of her. But she no longer looked human because her body had literally been torn apart. The deputy quickly left the house and called in his terrible discovery to the sheriff. And within an hour, Patrice's property was swarming with police and crime scene techs and a forensic expert who specialized in this type of scene, and detectives fanned out all across the area and began speaking to Patrice's neighbors. And because pretty much everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the same type of break-ins and property damage that Patrice had been, it actually didn't take long for police to develop a profile of Patrice's killer. Their conclusion was that very likely the killer was the same individual who was harassing everybody else. But what officials couldn't understand is why had everybody else experienced effectively minor vandalism, but Patrice went from minor vandalism to really excessive violence. And this required developing a profile of Patrice. And so as police searched for her killer, they were also working on reconstructing Patrice's movements on the final day of her life. And at first, in their efforts, really they were just stumped. I mean, all she had done on that day, as far as they could tell, were some basic chores. But as they dug into what those chores consisted of, they found two things that actually explained everything. It would turn out that every day for the past couple of years, Patrice had been making two terrible mistakes. She fed her cats out on the porch, and she emptied her compost into the garden. And these two actions ultimately were what sort of attracted her stalker, Big Bastard, to her home. Because Big Bastard was a black bear. He loved to eat cat food and kitchen compost scraps. And eventually, he decided that Patrice was food too. So on that day in early November of 2023, when Patrice fed her cats and emptied her compost for the last time, Big Bastard waited until Patrice was in bed and then broke into her house and savagely killed her. By the time the deputy arrived at Patrice's home, Big Bastard had been eating Patrice's body for days. And so what he saw in the kitchen was what was left of her. Black bears are not typically dangerous to people. In fact, Patrice was the first known black bear fatality in California history. But it was exactly that sort of lack of perceived danger, which is why officials didn't help Patrice or any of our other neighbors get rid of these black bears when they were coming into their neighborhood and causing all this property damage and all this alarm. They basically said, what's the worst they could do? Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's eye drops with acid. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In the 1960s, Alan Burkhart opened a riverfront restaurant in Beaumont, Texas. And for the next 50 plus years, his customers would eat burgers, drink beers, and on super hot days, they would jump off the pier into the river to cool down. But one day in June of 2015, while Alan was in his restaurant looking out the back window, he saw something strange in the river. When he went outside to get a better look, he noticed his customers who were eating outside had also noticed this strange thing, and now they were standing up and nervously watching it as it floated by. Alan immediately yelled out to everyone to not go swimming, obviously, based on what they were seeing, and then he went back inside and made a sign that said no swimming, and he posted it on the pier. A few weeks later, on July 2nd, a 28-year-old local man named Tommy Woodward and his girlfriend, Victoria LeBlanc, arrived at Alan's restaurant for a fun night out. After several hours of drinking and playing pool, Tommy and his girlfriend made their way over to the bar and had a seat, at which point Tommy began telling his girlfriend that he planned on going swimming in the river that night. The bartender overheard him and said, "Tommy, you can't go swimming in the river anymore." But Tommy was a bit of a rule breaker and said he didn't care, he was going to go anyways. The bartender began pleading with him and even got other staff members of the restaurant to talk sense into Tommy that he should not get in the water. But eventually Tommy just stood up, he grabbed his girlfriend's hand, left the restaurant, and began walking down towards the pier. The bartender at this point just kind of rolled her eyes and thought, I can't do anything to stop him, and so she went back to her bartending duties. When Tommy and Victoria got down to the pier, the black water was quiet and calm as Tommy took off his shirt and removed his valuables from his pockets. Right before Tommy was about to jump into the water, Victoria stopped him and said she thought she saw something moving underneath the pier. But Tommy just laughed and said he didn't care and jumped into the water and disappeared below the surface. Immediately, the water around Tommy seemed to erupt like a bomb had gone off underneath him. When Tommy came back up to the surface, he was screaming and trying to swim back to the pier, but before he could get there, something pulled him under the water. And then a few seconds later, Tommy came back up again, and this time Victoria could see the left side of his torso was bleeding profusely. And so she instinctively leapt into the water to try to save him. And Tommy, even though he knew he needed help, he said to her, "Get back on land, save yourself." And so she obliged. She climbed back onto the pier, and when she turned around, she caught a final glimpse of Tommy as he was pulled back under the water, and this time he did not come back up again. The bartender had heard screaming and so ran down with a flashlight to the pier, and when she got there, Victoria was hysterical and she was yelling Tommy's name and looking out over the water, and so the bartender at this point is reasonably certain she knows what happened to Tommy, but if by some miracle he's still alive, she wants to find him. And so she raises her flashlight and she begins scanning the now totally calm black water, and as she's scanning, she finds him. He's floating face down way off in the middle of the river, and as soon as the flashlight hits him, something pulls his body under the water and he disappears from view. It was no secret that the river that ran next to Alan's restaurant was home to alligators. But these alligators were small and they didn't bother anybody, and so the locals really didn't have any issue swimming with them. In fact, they had nicknamed 2 of the alligators that were seen the most often. They named them Cheeto and Marshmallow. But on that day in June of 2015, when Alan and the other guests saw this thing out in the river, what they were seeing was a monster alligator, the likes of which they had never seen before in this river. It was at least 11 feet long and over 400 pounds, and that summer it decided to make the underside side of Allen's Pier, its home. And so that night, when Tommy leapt into the water, it was this monster alligator's feeding time, and so Tommy became its dinner. About 2 hours after Tommy was attacked, what was left of him was recovered from the river. Tommy became the first alligator-related fatality in Texas in nearly 200 years. Just north of San Francisco, California, lies Lake Berryessa, which is a massive freshwater reserve that provides drinking water and hydroelectricity to hundreds of thousands of people. The lake is not a natural occurrence. A dam was built in the area in the 1950s, and after it was in place, the water that pooled above it became Lake Berryessa. During the dam's construction, the engineers realized the structure would not be enough to keep all the water in if the lake were to flood. To solve this problem, the engineers installed what's called a spillway in the middle of the lake. A spillway is like a huge drain. When the water levels in the lake are normal, none of the water will go into this drain. But when water levels reach a certain point, the water, instead of spilling over the side of the dam, will spill into this spillway, and it will travel 200 feet straight down the 78-foot wide pipe. And when it reaches the bottom, the pipe bends sharply to the right, and the water is shot out on the other side of the dam into a creek. On a summer day in 1997, 41-year-old graduate student Emily Schwalick was swimming in the recreational side of Lake Berryessa. That evening, before she got out of the water, she decided she wanted to have a closer look at the spillway, which at the time, because the water levels had risen high enough, water was pouring down into this spillway. So Emily turned around and began casually swimming away from the recreational area towards the center of the lake. At some point, she would have seen signs poking out of the water, and she would have seen them on land telling her to stay back. After passing those signs, she would have reached a long line of red caution buoys that were the last line of defense to try to keep people back from this spillway. But Emily went under those buoys and continued on towards this huge drain. Meanwhile, the other swimmers that had seen Emily take off towards the middle of the lake, they didn't think she would actually get close to the spillway. Nobody went close to the spillway, and so nobody tried to stop her. Around 6:10 p.m., Emily made it to right before the edge of the spillway. It would have been deafeningly loud as 360,000 gallons of water poured over the edge into the spillway every second. Emily most likely was trying to get right up to the edge and then grab that outer cement lip and kind of anchor herself and then lean over the edge and get a look down into the hole. But what ended up happening is as she got closer and closer to the edge, the current picked up so dramatically that it began pulling her down into the hole. And so by the time she's over this cement lip, she had already turned around, realizing her mistake, and was trying desperately to swim away from the spillway. But it was too late. Her legs got whipped around and sucked down into the spillway, and she managed to grab onto the lip, the outer lip of the spillway, with her legs now in the spillway. Thousands and thousands of gallons of water are pouring down on her face, and so she can't pull herself back up. So she's pinned inside the spillway. People on land noticed this happening to her, but they realized there was nothing they could do to help her. If they tried to go down there and pull her out, they would get sucked in too. And so they called the authorities, who have the right equipment, to pull her out. But by the time they got out there, it was too late. Emily had managed to hang on to that edge for 20 minutes. But finally, the water overpowered her, she lost her grip, and she fell backwards down the 200-foot chute to her death. On August 6th, 2018, a manager at a grocery store in Lancaster, California, which is a town about an hour north of Los Angeles, started getting complaints from his staff and from customers about a terrible smell coming from the front of the building. The manager, who had come in the back door that day and so hadn't smelled anything, began walking through the store towards the front in order to investigate. He only made it to the cash registers before he had to throw his arm over his mouth and his nose because the whole front half of the store reeked. The manager's first thought was that food must have somehow fallen somewhere out of view and it was rotting, and that was causing the smell. But when he went past the cash registers and went out the front doors, the smell got exponentially worse, and he noticed the smell was predominantly coming from this brown liquid on the ground that seemed to be leaking out of the base of one of the pillars that lined the front of the store. And so the manager thought, well, it can't be food that's causing the smell. It's got to be a sewer pipe leak that's happened right underneath this pillar, and it's seeping up through the cement, and that's what's causing the smell. And so the manager went back inside the store and he called a plumber, and then a couple of hours later, the plumber showed up. The manager pointed at the brown liquid out on the front and explained what he thought was going on, and the plumber looked at it and then looked at the manager and said, there's no sewer pipe underneath here, so whatever that liquid is, it's coming from inside the pillar. And so the manager was stumped because this pillar and all the others in the front of the store were purely decorative. There's no reason anything would be leaking out from inside of them. There was nothing inside of them. And so the manager asked the plumber to pull off one of the bricks around the area where this liquid was coming from so they could see what was on the other side. And so the plumber got his crowbar and he began prying off one of the bricks, and then once it was loose enough, he pulled the brick away, revealing an opening into the pillar, and the two men got down and they looked inside, and what they saw horrified them. And they immediately backed up and they called the police. 5 days earlier, a 35-year-old man named Ray Rivera was pulled over by Lancaster, California police on suspicion of driving a stolen vehicle. As soon as the officer got out of their cruiser and began approaching Ray's vehicle, Ray peeled off down the road, turned the corner, and was gone. The officer immediately got back in their cruiser and took off after Ray, but he had gotten a huge jump start and he had fled into a highly populated and busy area where it would be relatively easy to blend in and disappear. The officer called for backup, and before long, there were dozens of other cop cars in the area looking for Ray, but no one could find him. A little while later, the police heard over the radio that a car matching the description of the one Ray had been driving had just crashed into a local grocery store. And so the police head over to the grocery store, and sure enough, there's Ray's white pickup truck crashed into the side of the building, but Ray is nowhere to be found. The police began asking witnesses at the store if they had seen the man driving the white pickup truck, and a few said they had. They said after he crashed, he leapt out of the vehicle and he ran inside the grocery store and then went up a flight of stairs to the staff-only area. The police went inside the grocery store and searched the staff-only area, and they searched the rest of the grocery store, but he wasn't there. And so they assumed at some point after going inside, he managed to slip back out again and had escaped on foot. And so the police, just as a precaution, stayed outside of this grocery store for several more hours in case if Ray was in there, they would catch him trying to leave. But after a couple of hours, he never did. And so they put out a warrant for his arrest and they left. Well, it would turn out Ray had run inside the grocery store, but he had never left. After running up to that staff-only area, he found a crawl space and he hid inside of it for several hours until the police left. And then at some point that evening, he decided he wanted to find a better hiding spot, and so he made his way onto the roof. Now, it's not entirely clear how he did that. Either the crawl space he was in directly connected to the roof, or he got out of the crawl space and then found his way onto the roof another way. But regardless, he found his way onto the roof, and when he got up there, he realized the roof was totally flat until you got to the very front edge of the building, the part that looked down into the parking lot. There, on the roof, was this small structure that was built up just on the front end of the roof that gave the impression from the parking lot looking up that this building was a lot bigger than it really was. On the backside of this phony structure was a door that was accessible from the roof. Ray saw this access door and ran over to it. He tried the handle and it was unlocked. And so he opened it up and he went inside. Now, this attic-like space that sat on the front of the building really didn't have that much of a purpose to it. However, it did provide access to the insides of all of the pillars that lined the front of the store. And so it's believed that Ray, as soon as he walked inside, saw these openings and believed one of them would be the perfect hiding place. And so he lowered himself feet first into one of these hollow chutes. He got his feet and his legs, his hips, and most of his torso into this tight 9-inch by 17-inch space, but his shoulders were too broad. They would not fit into the pillar. And so he raised one arm over his head and he kept his other arm pinned by his side in order to make himself as narrow as possible. And this worked. Inch by inch, he began sliding deeper and deeper into this 2-story tall pillar until he was completely out of sight. But as soon as his shoulders had gone down into that pillar, he would have realized he had made a grave mistake. With one arm pinned above his head and the other pinned by his side, he would not have been able to pull himself back up out of this narrow space. He was stuck. And so he probably began squirming and trying to use his feet to try to get back up into the attic space, but all of that movement only made him slip farther and farther down into this pillar until his feet touched the ground at the absolute bottom. And so not only is he already in this totally compromised position that would have made it hard to breathe, he was also in such a narrow space that the walls of this pillar literally were crushing his chest, making it nearly impossible to get a full breath of air. And when he screamed out for help, nobody would have heard him because he was entombed inside of multiple layers of cement and brick. Also, making an already horrible situation that much worse, Lancaster, California was experiencing a very significant heat wave that month. And so all day long, the sun would have been blazing down on the outside of that pillar, heating up the inside like an oven. 5 days after Ray got trapped, the plumber removed that brick on the pillar, and he and the store manager bent down and looked, and they saw Ray's leg. The smelly brown liquid that had been coming out of the pillar that had alerted everyone to this in the first place was purge fluid, which is something that comes out of a decomposing body. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's eye drops with acid. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is the same on both platforms. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today I'm going to share 3 stories that all demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and secretly glue one thumbtack upturned on the surface of their favorite chair. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in October, very late during World War II, a Japanese soldier named Lieutenant Hiro Onoda crept out of the jungle on a small island in the Philippines called Lubang and crouched down at the edge of a huge rice field. Another soldier named Kazuka came out of the jungle behind him, and together they carefully crawled toward these huge bundles of rice that had just been harvested by the local farmers. And when they reached the first bundle, Onoda took 2 torches out of his bag. So when Onoda first arrived in Lubang, his mission had been to destroy the island's airfield, but everything had gone completely wrong. Allied forces, who were the enemy of the Japanese, had attacked the island, and the Japanese had evacuated. But by accident, they had left Onoda and Kozuka behind. And as far as they knew, there could be others who had been left behind as well, but as for right now, it was just those 2. But even though these 2 soldiers really had no idea if they would survive this, if they would ever get rescued or not, they still had a mission to do, and that was, to attack the enemy. And these bundles of rice, they knew were going to be sent to the other side to feed their enemy. And so they had to destroy them. So now Onoda lit the 2 torches, and then he and Kozuka set fire to the first bundle of rice. And then they took off running, stopping every few feet to set fire to another bundle of rice until the entire field was on fire. Gunshots rang out, and Onoda realized the enemy must have seen them, so he and Kazuka dropped their torches and they fled back into the jungle. Now, this pattern of attacking and sabotaging their enemy and then retreating back to the jungle where they could hide out was one they had done many, many times. It was sort of like the one thing that anchored their existence. They were actively still fighting the enemy until either they were killed or rescued. That was their North Star. Normally, they were quite good at this and they would be able to escape the enemy and get back to the jungle. But this time, as they were running away and Onoda's dodging bullets, literally, he heard Kozuka yell out behind him and then fall to the ground. A few weeks later, Onoda was alone, and he was patrolling the north side of the island. Kozuka had been shot and killed during their rice field sabotage, And so now Onoda was very likely the only Japanese soldier left on this island. And while Onoda knew, he was honor-bound to keep on fighting even by himself, which was obviously mentally much harder to do, by now he was just exhausted and depressed, living off banana peels and whatever else he could steal from local farmers. It was a pretty miserable existence. And also, ever since the Allied forces had killed Kazuka, they had somehow learned Onoda's name, and they'd stepped up their operations targeting him specifically. Onoda had had to leave the jungle and move into this underground cave he had found. But even there, he could still hear the sound of fighter jets flying overhead, clearly looking for him. And sometimes groups of enemy soldiers would patrol the jungle looking for him, which was near his cave, and they would call out for him by name and tell him to stop hiding and come on out. Now, as Onoda continued his patrol, he heard voices. So naturally, he crouched down and hid behind a boulder. And soon, 3 enemy soldiers came into view, and they clearly had no idea that Onoda was watching them because their rifles were slung over their shoulders and they were just kind of joking around with each other. But Onoda still panicked because he knew pretty soon they would notice his footprints and they would track him to his hiding spot. So even though there was clearly a part of Onoda that was very ready to be done fighting this war, finally, even if it meant being captured, really, he still forced himself to raise his rifle, take aim, and fire. Months passed by, and Onoda knew it was very likely springtime, and it had been weeks since he had seen any enemy soldiers on his patrols. He was holed up in his underground cave, and he was reading a letter that he had saved from home. And then he heard movement overhead, and somebody above ground called his name. So instinctively, Onoda reached for his rifle, but before he could do anything like pop out of the cave and start shooting, the person who had called out began to speak. And Onoda realized he knew this voice, and it was not an enemy soldier at all. Onoda crawled out of the cave, and when he saw the person standing there who was speaking to him, he just began to weep. It was his commanding officer, who he had been waiting for all this time. And the commanding officer was walking toward him with a group of other soldiers, friendly soldiers. Onoda climbed to his feet and immediately saluted the officer and asked if he was finally allowed to go home. And the officer said yes, because it would turn out that the date was March 9th, 1974. World War II had ended 29 years earlier. Onoda had spent almost 3 decades terrorizing not enemy soldiers, but Filipino farmers and villagers and police officers who he had simply mistaken for enemy troops because he believed they were still in this war. The Japanese government had thought Onoda and Kazuka were dead, but after Kazuka was killed and his body was recovered, Japan sent search parties out onto this island looking for Onoda. And Onoda thought the searchers were basically enemies trying to capture him, until he heard the voice of his old commanding officer. And at that point, he finally came out and laid down his arms. When Onoda finally returned to Japan, he received a hero's welcome. But it was sort of tainted because, innocent lives were lost when he was on this island believing he was fighting a war. In many ways, he was sort of terrorizing innocent people. He just didn't know it. And so the whole event was very sensitive, and ultimately Onoda went on to write an autobiography called No Surrender, and he would become a rancher and move to Brazil, where he would live until 2014, where he would die from heart failure. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. The strangest part isn't coming home. It's realizing you came back, but your mind didn't. You're trying to move through life doing everything right, work, family, responsibilities. But small moments feel off, and later you're left thinking, what's wrong with me? I also went through these exact same feelings when I left the military. My mind was very conflicted because the world sort of expected me to be normal, but it was like my nervous system still expected danger all the time. Trauma doesn't stay back there. It rewires you. It changes how you react, how you trust, how you love. But therapy can help break that pattern. BetterHelp makes that support easier to access. You fill out a short questionnaire and get matched with a credentialed therapist in as little as a couple of days. If it's not the right fit, you can switch anytime. Join the 6 million plus people who have gotten help from BetterHelp, the platform you can trust. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Around 11 p.m. on April 19, 1958, a 22-year-old man named Frank Isco drove along a coastal road in Santa Cruz, California, with two of his friends inside of his pickup truck. The road they were on was called West Cliff Drive, and it was this beautiful, scenic street that went along a cliff right next to the ocean, so it's got this amazing view. However, as Frank drove, he really couldn't see very much because it was nighttime and the road didn't have any streetlights, so the view was kind of lost on him. Frank glanced over at his friends, but they were both half asleep, and Frank himself was also pretty close to nodding off. So all three of the guys were completely exhausted because that morning they'd driven 50 miles from their hometown to Santa Cruz, and then they'd spent all day outside at the beach. Now they were all anxious to get home and just go to bed. Frank was especially ready to get home because his wife, Margaret, always waited up for him. And right now she was pregnant with their first child, so he really didn't want to keep her up all night. So Frank pressed his foot harder on the gas pedal and he zoomed along, enjoying the ocean view as much as he could see it and also listening to the sound of the waves, and began thinking about his wife. But as he drove along, he came up on this sharp curve in the road that he just hadn't seen because it was so dark out, and he was going so fast that when he hit the brakes, even though he began to slow down, he wasn't slowing down fast enough, and so he jerked his wheel trying to avoid what was going to happen here, but the truck, it spun out of control. Frank heard his friends wake up and start screaming, and Frank's desperately trying to will the car away from the edge of this road because there's a cliff down to the ocean, but it's like he just couldn't do it. The truck was spinning, and at the last second, he looked out his window and he saw his headlights were beaming off the metal barrier that kept you from going off the cliff, and he knew there was nothing he could do. And they slammed into the barrier, and then he felt the truck lurch past the barrier, and all of a sudden it's like they're weightless as he and his friends are falling off the cliff down to the ocean. In this split second, as they're literally falling off a cliff, Frank squeezed his eyes shut and just screamed along with his friends. And he expected at any moment that his truck was going to fall into the water and water would pour in through the windows and they would all just sink and drown. There'd be nothing they could do. But amazingly, Frank felt the truck slam into something that was unexpectedly hard. It clearly was not water. And suddenly they weren't falling anymore, and there was no water pouring into the truck. Frank was obviously disoriented from the impact and the darkness and all the confusion, and he really couldn't see what was going on, but he kind of checked himself and he could tell like he was okay, and he looked over at his friends and they too are completely shaken up, but alive. Everybody's okay, at least physically. And so Frank kind of frantically asked them before they even figured out what was going on here, like, hey, are you guys good? And his friends are like, yeah, we're good. And then instinctively, one of his friends who was sitting on the passenger side of the car opened up the passenger side door and kind of carefully looked out to see what was going on here. And the friends sort of looked at the other two and just said, we're stuck on a ledge. We got caught on a ledge. For a second, all three of the friends just froze. It was almost like if we move too much, maybe the car will rock off the ledge and fall the rest of the way down. But the friend kind of looked out again and it seemed like they were actually stable on this ledge. Basically, by some miracle, they had only fallen maybe 20 feet down this cliff, hit this ledge, and stopped instead of careening all the way down to the ocean, which, would have likely been death. Frank was so relieved and was so just amazed at their turn of luck in some ways that they had landed miraculously right here that he just started to laugh because all they'd have to do now is just carefully climb out and flag down a motorist. The road was like 20 feet above them. They could definitely get to the road or at least signal somebody on the road, and they'd be okay. And so Frank's two friends, they climbed fully out of the truck and actually stood on the rocky ledge on the passenger side. They get out, they're standing there, they're kind of surveying the ocean, thanking their lucky stars that they've survived. And Frank, he wants to get out too, to join them. But he decides to go out his door, open up his door and get out on the ledge that way. But as soon as he tried to open his door, he found it was stuck. And so instead, he just began rolling down his window and began climbing out. At the same time Frank was doing this, Frank's friends who were standing out on the ledge, they turned around to just look at him to see what he was doing. They could really only see, through the car, the shadowy shape of him in the darkness, but they watched as he clearly was climbing out his window to presumably get out on the ledge, and join them. But the instant he climbed out on the other side of the car, even though it was dark, they could sort of see him, the second he climbed out, it was like Frank just vanished. For a second, his friends were like, "Frank, where'd you go? Like, where are you?" But there was no response, and so carefully the friends kind of walked around the truck to see what Frank was doing. And when they saw what was on the other side of the truck where Frank presumably landed when he jumped out of the truck, they were horrified. It would turn out the ledge that Frank and his friends had landed on, the one that had saved their lives, was not an entirely solid surface, or more specifically, it was porous. In particular, there was one hole, big enough for a person to fit through. And that hole was on the immediate outside of the driver's side of the truck. And that hole that Frank didn't see when he jumped out of the window and he fell into, that hole was the entrance to an underwater cave. And Frank, who survived the fall, is now in this dark cave. He has no idea what's happened, and he starts trying to figure out a way out. And there's all these tunnels going everywhere. There's a little bit of water in there, but it's not very deep. And he got lost inside of this cave, and his friends are calling out to him. Rescuers showed up, but by the time the tide came in a couple hours later, Frank was nowhere near the entrance to the hole, so he couldn't let the water rise him up to the exit. He just had to wait for the water to fill in the space he was in, and he drowned. On the afternoon of December 19th, 1966, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim sat in a conference room inside of a government building in Cairo, Egypt. He was there as an employee of the Egyptian government, and he was sitting across from two governmental representatives from France. He felt very nervous because he'd been meeting with these same two men and trying to come to an agreement with them about a very important diplomatic decision for the last 4 months. But so far, they had not been able to make a deal. And that was because these French representatives wanted Mohammed, who was the Director General of Egyptian Antiques, to help them put together an exhibition in Paris that was all about ancient Egypt. And they specifically wanted Mohammed to loan them a collection of artifacts from an ancient Egyptian pharaoh's tomb. But Mohammed was afraid to loan these artifacts out because he and many other people in his world believed that these particular artifacts were sacred and should not be transported outside of Egypt because it was disrespectful to the pharaoh himself. So on this particular day, Mohammed just said to these French representatives that, like, guys, we're never going to reach a deal because I'm just not willing to loan these out. It feels disrespectful to this pharaoh. And he knew this sounded kind of crazy because the pharaoh has been dead for thousands of years, but that's how Mohammed felt. And he really wanted them to understand that this was not something he could change. This is how he felt. That's how it is. Now, up until this point, Mohammed, again, had been trying to make a deal with them, but had never really come out and said that ultimately his main sticking point is this disrespect of the pharaoh. And so this is the first time the French representatives are hearing this. And from Mohammed's perspective, when he said this to them, it looked like they almost wanted to laugh, like, are you kidding? But when they realized Mohammed was being completely serious here, they sort of shifted and had these looks of almost sympathy come across their faces. And then they promised Mohammed that, if you loan us these artifacts, that's not going to be disrespectful. In fact, if anything, it would actually honor the pharaoh because it would allow people all over France to see and appreciate the artifacts from his tomb. Mohammed and the French representatives went back and forth on this topic for hours. And eventually, Mohammed did start to see their side of things. It did make sense to him that maybe, allowing France to display the artifacts was a way of not disrespecting the pharaoh, but honoring the pharaoh. And so finally, perhaps against his better judgment, Mohammed officially agreed to loan out the artifacts, and then the meeting adjourned. A few minutes later, Mohammed walked out of the government building onto the busy sidewalk outside. And he felt lighter than he had in months. The deal was done, and he didn't have to think about it anymore. This was great. Now, all Mohammed wanted to do was just go home. And so he began walking towards the parking lot where his car was. And as he was heading across the street, looking straight ahead, he heard a loud, blaring noise and a screeching sound, and then everything went black. It would turn out those artifacts Mohammed had just agreed to loan out were from the tomb of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh king Tutankhamun. And Muhammad, along with many others, believed that these artifacts were not just sacred, but were also cursed. And that was because over the years, at least 11 people who had a connection to these artifacts had died. And it was believed that anybody who disrespected the artifacts would face King Tut's wrath. And just minutes after Muhammad convinced himself to agree to loan out these artifacts to France, he walked out of the government building in Cairo and he was hit and killed by a truck. His death made headlines all over the world because to this day, some people say this was just a horrible accident, but others insist he was yet another victim of King Tut's curse. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.